held the 2-hour and 50-minute hearing. It was chaired by Illinois Congressman Henry Hyde.
The committee will come to order. The procedure, ladies and gentlemen, will be an opening statement will be made by myself and by Mr. Lantos. There will be no more opening statements so we can have as much time as possible for questions, but every one of you who has a statement, without objection, it will be made a part of the record. And so if we're ready, Mr. Secretary, welcome to the Committee on International Relations. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you for your dedicated service to our country. We're eager to hear your testimony, but before that, I would like to offer a few thoughts, and I will then ask my friend, the distinguished ranking Democratic member, Mr. Lantos, to offer remarks of his own. We meet at a time of great peril and great opportunity. The peril is obvious. Aggressive regimes armed with weapons of mass destruction, uncontrolled by any domestic political constraints, and linked to international terrorist networks in a shadow world of malice where the murder of innocents is considered a noble vocation. These threaten the very possibility of order in world affairs. In Iraq, the world's 58-year experiment with collective security is being put to the supreme test. If Iraq is permitted to defy 12 years of United Nations resolutions demanding its disarmament, then that 58-year experiment in collective security will be, for all intents and purposes, over. In enforcing the will of the UN as expressed most recently in Resolution 1441, the United States and its allies are upholding the minimum conditions for world order. Let us hope that Iraqi disarmament can be enforced with united support of the Security Council, but let us make certain that effective and decisive enforcement takes place by what the President has called a coalition of the willing, if necessary. This peril also contains, in my view, a great opportunity. The opportunity is to recast the politics of a turbulent region of the world so that opportunities for real stability are created. What we often call stability in the Middle East has been for the past half-century the most volatile instability. The world cannot live with this instability much longer. It threatens world peace, it threatens the global economy, and as the bitter lesson of September 11 taught us, the instability of the Middle East can now reach around the globe and directly threaten the security of the people of the United States. America is often said to be a hyperpower, yet our actions are repeatedly frustrated by an endless train of objections and obstacles. America has fought distant wars to defend whole continents from a succession of aggressors, but the beneficiaries of the safety we have ensured often devote their energies to impeding our efforts to help others. We shoulder burdensome responsibilities for the benefit of the entire globe, but too often we must do it alone. Americans are rightly puzzled by this and by what appears to many to be ingratitude and even hostility on the part of friends and allies. We see our own motives as noble and believe this fact to be self-evident. We are not an imperial power coldly focused on the subjugation of others or on securing some narrow advantage for ourselves. Instead, we are frequently moved to action by the plight of others, often losing sight of our own self-interest in our zeal to make the world right. None can doubt that for over half a century we have employed our power in the service of making the world safe, peaceful, and prosperous to the extent of our ability to do so. It is true that we are not motivated by altruism alone. We cannot be, for we have a responsibility for our own welfare that cannot be delegated to others, not even the United Nations. But altruism has always been woven into the policies of our republic. Given the nature of our fundamental principles and beliefs, it cannot be otherwise. How is it then that we do so much for so many others and yet have to plead for their support? Why is it always so difficult to enlist others in causes from which all benefit? Why do we carry global responsibilities, yet others feel no need to assume a share of the collective burden? While it may be tempting to resent our allies and others for what appears as cynical and perverse behavior, the truth is, this puzzle is one of our own making. It is, in fact, the product of our very success in remaking the world. It is the defining trait of what may be termed the pathology of success. Great success often prompts a corresponding envy in others, and our occasional humbling is a rich and guilty pleasure, often indulged in by friends and foes alike. That is the principal reason Castro is celebrated by a spectrum of leaders stretching from third world dictators to our NATO allies. The former take heart from the fact that he has defied the power of the United States and survived. For the latter, cultivating ties with our declared enemy has long been an easy and risk-free way for them to demonstrate their independence from us, even as we remain pledged to their defense. Dependence can also evoke a corrosive resentment that can slumber in the deepest layers, even with friends. This is especially true among those whose ambitions are not matched by their capabilities, and who are reminded of their less than central role in the world by what they believe is our failure to sufficiently consult with them regarding our own decisions. Ultimately, however, these explanations do not adequately describe the phenomenon. The fundamental problem is simply this: given our strength, the urgency of our many concerns, and our willingness to proceed alone if necessary, we have liberated others from the responsibility of defending their own interests, to say nothing of any responsibility for the collective interests of the West. Many would watch the night descend on others in faraway countries of which they know little, without any feeling that perhaps they should do something to halt it, and that not doing so might be a perilous option. Far from assisting, they might even devote their energies to preventing others from doing something. The vast extent of our success has created the equivalent of a moral hazard, the dangers of which we are encountering with increasing frequency. The clearest example of this in the international system is Europe. In the 1500 years following the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was a warring continent where suspicion and betrayal were forces of nature, and peace but an uncertain interlude between conflicts. This world was upended by the United States. In the aftermath of World War II, with Europe devastated and still smoldering from ancient hatreds, the United States assumed a dominant role in all aspects, reviving prostrate economies with unprecedented... I won't touch that. I won't touch that. It's too painful. Reviving prostrate economies with unprecedented aid, shoring up weak democracies, insisting on ever closer cooperation between former enemies, establishing the institutions by which a unity of purpose came into being, weaving the whole into a community. And embracing it all, the United States provided an absolute guarantee of safety. Problems shrank to the scale of daily life. Dangers evaporated into abstract metaphors. Sheltered by American power, the hostilities of the untamed world beyond became remote and then imaginary. This unearned inheritance did not require any of the beneficiaries to assume any risk, take on oppressive burdens, acknowledge their debt, or do anything other than focus on a pursuit of self-interest. They remained safe, regardless of what they did or did not do. The natural state of the world was transformed from one ruled by fear and competition to one of safety and peace. And like nature, it required no effort on the part of man to bring it into being. Instead of hard choices of war and peace, it was more akin to selecting from an a la carte menu, guided only by one's taste and momentary preferences. It was a profoundly false view of the world, but can we fault those who were raised in this cocoon of our own making? We may blame others for their short-sightedness, but it is we who have distorted their perceptions of reality. It is we who have created a beneficent but artificial environment, so secure that its beneficiaries believe it to be self-sustaining. They feel neither need nor obligation to do anything to defend their interests, to secure those of the West, to ensure order rather than disorder in the world beyond their garden. Seen from this perspective, the United States becomes not the protector of the West in Iraq and elsewhere, but its tormentor. Its power not the source of security, but of disorder, a blundering and myopic Goliath whose misguided efforts are threatening to all. If only the U.S. were to desist, they say, we would once again be serene. The image is so inverted that one can almost hear the distant musical strains of the world turned upside down. To a lesser degree, a similar situation prevails in East Asia, where the conquest, oppression, fear, and war of the past have given way to a prosperous, cooperative, secure system of free states, one which I'm pleased to say is populated by an increasing number of democracies. The United States played a direct hand in bringing about many of these historic changes, but its most profound contribution was to create and defend a nurturing and secure environment in which this transformation could take place. And we have defended it with tens of thousands of American dead and uncounted billions in treasure. But here again, we see the dangerous abdication of responsibility that has risen out of the artificial environment we have established. All problems have become America's responsibility, while others, even those with more immediate interests than our own, stand on the sidelines offering passive encouragement or vocal abuse. We see the absurdity of this situation in the current crisis regarding North Korea. Somehow this problem is judged by both ourselves and others to be ours, and ours almost alone. It's not seen as a challenge to be met by the countries of East Asia, which watch to see the course we will take in order to tack to the prevailing winds. It's not assumed to be that of the rest of the world, which distractedly wonders why the U.S. has not yet resolved this faraway problem. Nor is it that of China, whose influence in Pyongyang is paramount, and without whose assistance the regime would quickly collapse. It's not even that of South Korea, which we liberated at great cost in young lives and have defended from conquest for over half a century, but where we are now openly accused of being the unwelcome source of that peninsula's misfortunes. The familiarity of these problems, however, obscures a deeper danger. We've entered a new and more threatening century, one in which the civilized world will be under increasing assault from the forces of terror and dismemberment. These forces cannot be dissuaded by reason or by the paying of tribute. We are certain to discover that our ability to hold back the rising tide of disorder is finite, and we cannot by ourselves defend the West from those who even now are plotting our destruction. Others must now take up their long ignored responsibility and assume their place in the line, not only for their own sake, but for all of us. We cannot await disaster to awaken them from their dreams of summer. Instead, we must expose them to the dangers of a rough reality, for only with the ensuing abrasions is there hope that their comforting illusions can be worn away. The alarm has already begun to sound, but as yet it remains unheard. Justice demands that I make an exception to my reproach, and that exception is Britain. Our ties are deep. Britain remains the mother country even for those Americans whose ancestors never touched British soil. We're joined not merely by common interests, but by a shared recognition that if the world is to be preserved, we have no option but to accept our duty. For Britain, the term ally is insufficient. We are in truth partners. In saying this, I do not mean to fail to express my admiration for the dozens of countries who have bravely offered their support. We have made much of the world a welcoming one for all the wondrous things to which mankind has aspired over the centuries, but we have also established it on a perilous foundation, one that permits its citizens a fatal irresponsibility. The fault is ours, not theirs. It's we who have mistakenly allowed others to learn a false and dangerous lesson. To believe that the peace and safety of the West, the product of centuries of effort, will maintain itself, that order need not be wrested from the storms and chaos that surround us. To believe that our world is not a fragile thing is to risk everything. We have, in fact, made our world safe in the disastrous belief that others need not share a part of the collective burden, that there is no burden to be borne by all. We may, in fact, be risking everything. Let me quote the warning by the philosopher Ortega y Gasset: if you want to make use of the advantages of civilization, but are not prepared to concern yourself with the upholding of civilization, you are done. Just a slip, and when you look around, everything has vanished into air. One of the paradoxes of our time, that the American people who have never dreamed dreams of empire should find themselves given a unique responsibility in the course of world history. As you said so eloquently during your recent speech at Davos, Mr. Secretary, Americans did not go into the world in the 20th century for self-aggrandizement, but rather for the liberation of others, asking of those others only a small piece of ground in which to bury our dead, who gave their lives for the freedom of men and women they never knew or met. Now, in these first determinative years of the 21st century, we're being challenged to such large tasks again. We did not ask to be so challenged, but we dare not let the challenge go unanswered. That's why we're grateful for your time this morning, Secretary Powell. That's why we're grateful for you, because there are many things to discuss as we consider how our actions in the next weeks and months can create conditions for a new Middle East, for a new and more humane method of managing world affairs, so that freedom's cause may flourish. I apologize for the prolixity of my remarks, but there were things I wanted to say, and now with pleasure I yield to Mr. Lantos for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first commend you on a powerful and thoughtful statement, and let me identify myself with it. This Congress and this country is fortunate to have you in a position of leadership in the field of foreign policy. Secretary Powell, let me thank you for joining us today. I believe I can speak for all of us in expressing my deepest gratitude for your extraordinary public service on behalf of our nation. Let me also add my voice to the chorus praising your presentation at the United Nations Security Council last week. It was a brilliant performance, revealing not one smoking gun, but 100. You removed all doubts that Saddam Hussein is deliberately and systematically hiding his weapons of mass destruction in clear violation of his international obligations. You made an utterly compelling case against Saddam Hussein, and in doing so set a new standard at the UN Security Council. Prior to your presentation, Ms. Secretary, we spoke of a Stevenson moment, referring to Ambassador Adlai Stevenson's dramatic performance during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Hereafter, we shall speak of a Powell moment. Although the case against Saddam is closed, the course we now take to disarm him remains open to debate. I, for one, support the strong position as the best means of achieving disarmament and peace. Other members of Congress and other members on this committee honestly disagree. As we consider the question of deploying our armed forces, let no one question the patriotism of those who oppose doing so. All of us are patriots, devoting to protecting our nation's interests and promoting our values. Now, Mr. Secretary, I do not hold many of our so-called European allies in the same esteem. As one born in Europe, who I think fully understand the unlimited cynicism of some European leadership, I am particularly disgusted by the blind intransigence and utter ingratitude of France, Germany, and Belgium, countries which blocked our efforts to even engage in contingency planning if our ally Turkey were attacked by Iraq. In my judgment, NATO is a two-way street, providing protection and demanding commitment. The United States has upheld its commitments, and if it were not for the heroic efforts of our military, France, Germany, and Belgium today would be Soviet socialist republics. I wish to repeat that. Had it not been for our military commitment, France, Germany, and Belgium today would be Soviet socialist republics. The failure of these states to honor their commitments is beneath contempt. Mr. Secretary, thanks to your efforts, I believe the administration has succeeded in making a compelling case against Iraq. It has not yet succeeded, however, in marshalling the energies, resources, and passions of the American people for this fight. While our brave men and women in uniform, active duty, reserves, National Guard, prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice is called upon, the President has asked virtually nothing of Americans on the home front. The recent death of U.S. military and diplomatic personnel to enemy fire in Afghanistan, Kuwait, and Jordan just underscores the disparity in the sacrifices Americans are called upon to make. Ms. Secretary, you certainly know the meaning of sacrifice. As a lifelong soldier and public servant, you have laid your life on the line for your country for decades. Many of us of earlier generations also know the meaning of sacrifice. We know that our freedom is not free, that our nation's blessings are as much hard-earned as they are God-given. We also know the value of shared sacrifice in unifying our nation behind a worthy cause. The administration, however, clearly does not fully appreciate the value of shared sacrifice. This is most evident in its tax policies. Mr. Secretary, you do not lead the Department of Treasury, and this is not the Ways and Means Committee. But the misguided tax cuts proposed by the administration impact our national security by exempting the most affluent Americans from any sacrifice. It is fundamentally unfair to ask some to possibly sacrifice all and ask others to sacrifice nothing. As the nation prepares for war and our military men and women risk their lives, how can anyone possibly justify such unpalpably unfair tax breaks for our wealthiest citizens? The administration's proposed tax cuts denigrate the patriotic sacrifices of some of our fellow Americans are asked to make. They also threaten to undermine the cohesion of the nation. I look forward with great anticipation to your presentation, Ms. Secretary. You have done the nation extraordinary service, and we are deeply in your debt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lantos. We will now go to the part of the program involving questions. I would ask members to, I'm sorry.
It is Lincoln's birthday.
I thought I would save you from defending tax policy.
It's indefensible, Mr. Chairman.
We'll have Economics 101 later, but Mr. Secretary, please take extra time.
The more taxes you cut, the more money we get.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was about to lay prostrate before the committee. It's, of course, a pleasure for me to appear again before the committee, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your powerful opening statement. And, Mr. Lantos, I thank you for your words as well. And with your permission, I will leave tax policy to Mr. Snow and other members of the administration.
Shows great wisdom.
But it is a pleasure to be before the committee again, and to begin by thanking all of the members of the committee for the solid support that you have provided to me, but more importantly to the department, and even more importantly to the men and women of the Department of State who are serving their nation with such distinction around the world, and as was noted by Mr. Lantos, putting themselves in harm's way and taking casualties just like soldiers do. And knowing that they have your support means a lot to them. And I'm here this morning to ask for your support again in the upcoming fiscal year. I will get, I'm sure, in the course of questioning, the opportunity to talk about all of the various regional issues you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, but I hope that you will bear with me as I focus on the budget for just a few moments. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I do have a full statement which I would like to submit for the record, and then just shorten that statement with a few words. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I am pleased to appear before you to testify in support of the President's International Affairs budget for fiscal year 2004. Funding requested for FY 2004 for the Department of State, USAID, and other foreign affairs agencies is $28.5 billion. The President's budget will allow the United States to, first, target security and economic assistance to sustain key countries supporting us in the war on terrorism, and help us to stem the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Next, this budget will help us launch the Millennium Challenge Account, a new partnership generating support to countries that rule justly, that invest in their people, and encourage economic freedom. Also strengthen the United States and global commitment to fighting HIV/AIDS and alleviating humanitarian hardships. Next, help us to combat illegal drugs in the Andean region of South America, as well as bolster democracy in one of that region's most important countries, Colombia, and reinforce America's world-class diplomatic force, focusing on the people, places, and tools needed to promote our foreign policies around the world. I am particularly proud and committed to that last goal, Mr. Chairman, because for the past 2 years I have concentrated on each of my jobs: primary foreign policy advisor to the President, but just as importantly, Chief Executive Officer and Chief Leader of the State Department. And under my leadership, or CEO hat, we are asking for $8.5 billion within that 28.5 number. And let me give you some highlights of what these particular funds are for. First, we have been reinforcing our diplomatic force for 2 years, and will continue to do so in FY 2004. For some period of time in the last decade, in the 90s, we simply weren't hiring new Foreign Service officers and civil service employees into the department, and that was a disaster. If you want to have an ambassador in 15 years, you've got to hire a junior officer now. Just as if you want to have a battalion commander in 15 years, you got to hire a second lieutenant now. You can't have air bubbles in a personnel pipeline. We've turned that around. We are encouraging Americans to come forward and apply to be members of this wonderful State Department of ours, and they have been responding. In the last 2 years, some 80,000 young Americans have signed up to take the Foreign Service written exam, a very tough exam. We're also reaching out more throughout our society so that the State Department can look more like America and more like the world. And I'm pleased that in the last Foreign Service exam, for example, 38% of those passing the exam were minorities. And so we're reaching out throughout all of the communities of America to get more young Americans to step forward, and they are stepping forward. But if Congress doesn't give me the money to hire some of them, then I'm wasting my time. And so I'm very pleased that Congress has been willing to do that. And in this new submission, I'll be able to hire 399 more professionals to help the President carry out the nation's foreign policy. And this third year of this increased hiring will amount to 1,100 new professionals within the department, and it gets us well above the attrition level. So people can go to training. People can do other things other than just deal with the daily workload. We'll have a little bit of flexibility in our personnel system. Moreover, completion of these hires will show to the department that what we said at the beginning of this administration came true. We believe in the department. We believe in taking care of our people and giving them the additional people to join them to get the work done. Second, I promise to bring state-of-the-art communications capability to the department, because people who can't communicate rapidly and effectively in today's globalizing world can't carry out our foreign policy. I told the members of the department that before I left, I wanted every person in the department, no matter where they were in the world, to have Internet capability on their desk, classified and unclassified, and we're charging forward on that goal. We have to make sure that we are in tune with the kind of world we're living in with respect to information technology, with respect to the speed of communication. By way of illustration of how we're trying to do this, after my presentation to the UN last Wednesday afternoon, within minutes, it was all being translated into multiple languages, being instantly downloaded at all of our embassies. All of our embassy teams prepared to take that presentation, turn it around, get it out to the people in the countries in which they are accredited to. And we have got to be able to do that more and more on an instantaneous basis. I've told some of my staff members that on Thursday morning, looking at the reviews of Wednesday's presentation and some of the pictures, the picture that touched me the most as I looked through the newspapers was a picture of a ready room in an aircraft carrier. And these Marine aviators were sitting in their flight seats, these seats where they get briefed for a mission. And they were sitting in the ready room watching the presentation that I was making at the UN the day before. So they're not waiting to read it in a newspaper. They're not waiting for a brilliant talking head to explain it to them. They're not waiting for the evening news. They're getting the information instantaneously direct to the consumer, them. And nobody had more of an interest in what I was talking about than these young aviators who may well have to go into combat. So that ability to communicate instantaneously, to spread knowledge instantaneously, I've got to drive that into every single corner of the State Department and put it on every desk in the State Department. And we're well along the way to doing that, and I ask for your continued support. Also, with respect to my CEO role, I wanted to sweep the slate clean and completely revamp the way we construct our embassies and other overseas facilities. I found a program that was in some difficulty when I arrived. I put in charge General Chuck Williams, who you've all come to know, former Army officer, Corps of Engineer officer, and he's turned the place around, and he's got a great team working with him. Our embassies are now coming in under cost, more cheaply. We reduced the cost of building. We are using the most modern management techniques with respect to construction, and I ask you again for solid support for that program in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion this year. Mr. Chairman, as the principal foreign policy advisor to President Bush, I have budget priorities as well in that hat. And let me highlight just a few of our foreign policy funding priorities before I stop, make a few remarks in response to you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Lantos, and then turn it over to questions. The 2004 budget proposes several initiatives to advance U.S. national security interest and preserve American leadership. The 2004 Foreign Operations budget that funds programs for the Department of State, USAID, and other foreign affairs agencies is $18.8 billion. Today, our number one priority is to fight and win the global war on terrorism. The budget furthers this goal by providing economic, military, and democracy assistance to key foreign partners and allies, including $4.7 billion to countries that have joined us on the front line of the campaign against terrorism. Of this amount, the President's budget provides $657 million for Afghanistan, $460 million for Jordan, $395 million for Pakistan, $255 million for Turkey, $136 million for Indonesia, and $87 million for the Philippines. In Afghanistan, the funding will be used to fulfill our commitment to rebuild Afghanistan's road network. In addition, it will establish security through a national military and national police force, establish broad-based and accountable governance through democratic institutions and an active civil society, ensure a peace dividend for the Afghan people through economic reconstruction, and provide humanitarian assistance to sustain returning refugees and displaced persons. United States assistance will continue to be coordinated with the Afghan government, the United Nations, and other international donors. Now, that's pretty bureaucratic, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The bottom line is we have a success story in Afghanistan. Is it still fragile? Yes. Are there still al-Qaeda elements and Taliban elements running around? Yes. Are we going to be there a long time? Yes. But what we have accomplished in the last year and a half or so has been rather incredible. When you consider that we removed a terrible regime, we flushed al-Qaeda so that they're on the run, we put in place a government that is representative of the people, and respectful of the people. We have started the reconstruction effort to put in roads and schools and hospitals. Women are now being integrated into public life throughout Afghanistan. Over 1 million refugees have returned to this country. By voting in that way with their feet, they are showing confidence in the future of Afghanistan, and we can be proud that we helped give the Afghan people that confidence. Mr. Chairman, I also want to emphasize our efforts to decrease the threats posed by terrorist groups, rogue states, and other non-state actors with regard to weapons of mass destruction and related technology. To achieve this goal, we must strengthen partnerships with countries that share our views in dealing with the threat of terrorism and resolving regional conflicts. The 2004 budget requests $35 million for the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Fund, more than double the 2003 request. It increases funding for overseas export controls and border security to $40 million and supports additional funding for science centers and biochem redirection programs. Funding increases requested for these programs will help us prevent weapons of mass destruction falling in the hands of terrorist groups or states by preventing their movement across borders and by destroying or safeguarding known quantities of weapons or source material. The science centers and biochem redirection programs support the same goals by engaging former Soviet weapons scientists and engineers in peaceful scientific activities, providing them an alternative to marketing their skills to states or groups of concern. The budget also promotes international peace and prosperity by launching the most innovative approach to U.S. foreign assistance in more than 40 years. The new Millennium Challenge account, an independent government corporation funded at $1.3 billion, will redefine development aid. As President Bush told African leaders meeting in Mauritius recently, this aid will go to nations that encourage economic freedom, that root out corruption, and that respect the rights of their people. It's money that will be used to reinforce their commitment to democracy, to make sure that they stay on the path of the rule of law, of democracy, of economic freedom, and of the rights and privileges of their people to select their own leaders and seek their own destiny within a democratic system. Moreover, this budget offers hope and a helping hand to countries facing health catastrophes, poverty and despair, and humanitarian disasters. The budget includes more than $1 billion to meet the needs of refugees and internally displaced peoples. The budget also provides more than $1.3 billion to combat the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. The President's total budget for HIV/AIDS is $2 billion, which includes the first year's funding for the new emergency plan for HIV/AIDS relief that the President announced in his State of the Union address. These funds will target 14 of the hardest-hit countries in Africa and the Caribbean. This budget also includes almost $500 million for Colombia. This funding will support Colombian President Uribe's unified campaign against terrorists and the drug trade that fuel their terrorist activities. The aim is to secure democracy, extend security, and restore economic prosperity to Colombia and prevent the narco-terrorists from spreading instability to the broader Andean region. To accomplish this goal requires more than simply funding for Colombia. Therefore, to deal with other nations in the region, our total Andean counter-drug initiative is for $731 million. Critical components of this effort include resumption of the air bridge denial program to stop internal and cross-border aerial trafficking and illicit drugs, stepped-up eradication and alternative development efforts, and technical assistance to strengthen Colombia's police and judicial institutions. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, to advance America's interest around the world, we need the dollars that have been requested for my department in the President's fiscal year budget for 2004. We need the dollars under both of my hats, CEO as well as Principal Foreign Policy Advisor. Mr. Chairman, I am prepared to answer all of the questions you might have on the budget and other matters, but for just a moment, let me just say a word or two about some of the issues raised in the opening statements. First, with respect to Iraq. Mr. Chairman, when the international community came together after President Bush's speech to the United Nations on the 12th of September, it came together with a certain understanding that if the United Nations was going to remain relevant, it had to act on this challenge that had been put before the United Nations by Saddam Hussein, a challenge that had been put before the United Nations for the previous 12 years, and through 16 resolutions, the United Nations had demanded compliance by Saddam Hussein of his obligations under those resolutions, and he ignored the United Nations. The President went to the United Nations because this was a problem, as you noted, sir, not just for the United States, but for the whole world. Saddam Hussein is a threat to his own people, he's a threat to his neighbors, and ultimately he'll be a threat to the whole world with the development of weapons of mass destruction. This was not a charge dreamed up by the United States of America. It was a statement of the Security Council of the United Nations, repeated year after year after year. And what the President said to them on the 12th of September, it's time to get serious and put action to the words. Over the next 7.5 weeks, I worked with my colleagues in the Security Council, and we came up with a strong resolution, Resolution 1441, which was passed on the 8th of November. This resolution did several things which sometimes people forget, and some of the people who voted for the resolution forget. First and foremost, it said Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime are guilty. It isn't a matter of needing more evidence. They have been found guilty previously. They are guilty now. They remain in material breach of their obligations under previous resolutions. So there's no question about whether they're guilty or not, and every member voting that day understood that simple proposition. Second, we said there's a way to resolve this to the Iraqi regime. There's a way to get out of this problem that you have put yourself in, and that way is to comply, to give up your weapons of mass destruction, to turn over the documents, to make people available to be interviewed, scientists and engineers, to bring them out of the country so they won't be intimidated, to show us where these facilities are, to bring forth all that you have been doing. And that's what the resolution called for Iraq to do. To help you, we will strengthen the inspection system and give more authority to Dr. Blix and Dr. Al-Baradei in order to help Iraq comply. And then finally, to make sure that Iraq understood the seriousness of this issue, the final part of the resolution clearly said that if there are new material breaches, further material breaches, meaning Iraq has not complied as it must, then serious consequences will flow. Every member sitting in the council that day and all of their capitals understood that serious consequences meant if Iraq did not take this last chance, this last opportunity to come into compliance, they would face military force in order to bring them into compliance, in order to disarm them. There was no confusion in that council that day, I can assure you, because we worked on that document for 7.5 weeks. We now have 3 months of experience under that resolution, and Saddam Hussein has not complied. He sent forward a false declaration 30 days after the resolution was enacted, 1 day short of 30 days. And in that declaration, he gave us a lot of smoke. We specifically put that in there as an early requirement, a 30-day requirement, in order to test him, to see whether or not he was going to seriously undertake his obligations. He failed the test. Nobody can dispute that. He has also failed to give the inspectors the kind of cooperation that is needed for the inspectors to do their work. I don't think there's any dispute about that, and we'll hear more about this from Dr. Blix and Dr. El-Baradei on Friday. And so we are reaching a moment of truth with respect to this resolution and whether it meant anything or not. We are reaching a moment of truth with respect to the relevance of the United Nations Security Council to impose its will on a nation such as Iraq, which has ignored the will of the Council for the last 12 years. And we are reaching a moment of truth as to whether or not this matter will be resolved peacefully or will be resolved by military conflict. The President still hopes it can be resolved peacefully. I think everybody has that hope. I have that hope. I don't like war. I've been in war. I've sent men into war. I've seen friends die in war. Nobody wants war. But sometimes it's necessary when you need it to maintain international order. And the United States is prepared to lead a coalition, either under UN auspices or, if the UN will not act, demonstrates its irrelevance, and then the United States is prepared with a coalition of the willing to act. And it will be a good coalition, a strong coalition. There are some of my European colleagues right now who are resisting the natural flow of this resolution and what's supposed to happen. They want to have more inspectors. More inspectors aren't the issue. Dr. Blix hasn't asked for more inspectors. Dr. El-Baradei has not asked for more inspectors. It's not clear Saddam Hussein would let more inspectors in. But that's not the issue. The issue is lack of Iraqi compliance. And just to say we need more inspectors is a way of delaying, of diverting attention from the basic proposition Iraq is not complying, and the resolution spelled out clearly what should happen at that time. And the United States will not shrink back from the obligations that we undertook when we worked to get that resolution passed. I hope that in the days ahead we will be able to rally the United Nations around the original resolution and what other resolution might be necessary in order to satisfy the political needs of a number of the countries. But the United States will not be deterred. Iraq must be disarmed peacefully or through the use of military force. And it is interesting and challenging, Mr. Chairman, to watch the politics of this unfold, especially within Europe. France and Germany are resisting. They believe that more inspections, more time. The question I put to them is, why more inspectors and how much more time? Or are you just delaying for the sake of delaying in order to get Saddam Hussein off the hook and no disarmament? That's a challenge that I will put to them again this Friday and next week as debate continues on this issue. Nations such as the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, many of the newly independent states who were once enslaved and under dictators who understand the consequences of not dealing with a dictator when one should deal with a dictator are solidly on our side. We have these debates within NATO and within Europe all the time. Financial Times made reference this morning to Charles de Gaulle back in 1956 saying the United States is a superpower that has to be brought under control. And so we've seen these kinds of expressions and hyperpower complaints previously. I still believe that it is possible to rally the international community to discharge its obligations. All of the nations that we are now having debates with are, at the end of the day, allies and friends of ours. We've had our disagreements, we've had our fights in the past, and we have always managed to find a way forward. And it's my job as Secretary of State to work with these nations and find a way forward, but never by compromising our principles and our strong beliefs, but by using the power of our principles to convince others of what we should do in a collective fashion. One final point, Mr. Chairman. Somebody asked me yesterday, well, suppose there is a military conflict. Infidels would be going into Iraq. Isn't that going to be terrible? Isn't going to just all kinds of heck going to break loose? I said, yeah, well, nobody complained when infidels went into Kuwait to save the people of Kuwait from an Iraqi invasion. We were welcomed by the Muslim population of Kuwait, which had been invaded by a Muslim nation. Nobody talked about infidels when we acted in Kosovo a few years ago. Nobody talked about infidels when we were in Afghanistan today, because what the Afghan people are learning today is what the people of Japan and Germany and so many other places have learned over the years. America comes in peace. America comes as a partner. America comes to help people, to put in place better systems of government that respect the rights of men and women. America never comes as a conqueror. America comes to do the principal thing in the interest of peace and the interest of stability. And that will continue to be the philosophy by which this president runs our foreign policy. Mr. Chairman, let me just stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating statement. We'll now go to the questions, and I ask the members to be as succinct as they can and not trespass on someone else's 5 minutes. And we'll start with Mr. Leach.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for a thoughtful presentation, particularly your ending assertions. It strikes, I think, all of the American people that the Iraqi dilemma is self-evident in the sense that there are a massive number of unknowns. That is, intervention could be short, decisive, respected around the world, if not supported. On the other hand, rather than lessening the likelihood of use of weapons of mass destruction, it might precipitate their utilization and might as well increase terrorism from many quarters. In this context, as well as in the context of the massing of forces in the region, it would seem that the only win-win prospect for the American people, the Iraqi people, and everybody else in the region would be in the next few days for Saddam Hussein and his cohorts to abdicate and accept asylum. The problem with asylum is that it's an idea in search of a strategy. And so my question is the United States prepared to accept as part of a UN resolution or in other ways to urge the Secretary General of the United Nations to advance an asylum strategy to Saddam and his cohorts? The likelihood of its acceptance might not be high. On the other hand, an offer would underscore to the world that our issues with Saddam, our issues with the weapons of mass destruction program, and not necessarily with Iraqi sovereignty or Iraqi oil. And so my query is there more than simply contemplation of asylum within this administration? Is there a strategy to advance it? And is the United States prepared to press an asylum option before invading?
We are not only discussing it, we are in touch with a number of countries that have expressed an interest in conveying this message to the Iraqi regime that time's up, and one way to avoid a lot of suffering is for the regime to step down. Saddam Hussein and his cohorts. We are looking at the various aspects of such a strategy: asylum, where, with what protection, or with you know exactly how you would operationalize this. I haven't had a direct conversation with the Secretary General about it, but as part of our contemplation and our strategizing of this issue, it would ultimately require some kind of United Nations participation in order to make sure that we can do it in a way that would actually entice him to seek asylum. So it is something we're looking at, and we recognize the attractiveness of such an option. It avoids a lot of problems, and it would have to include him, and it would have to include his top level. We would have to get the whole infection out and then get on with the healing process.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
The next will be Mr. Lantos. I might announce to the new members, the procedure we follow is we call you in the order in which you arrived at the hearing. That scorecard is kept by the staff, and so if it seems to be going out of order occasionally, it's due to the idiosyncrasies of that tradition, which we still live by. Mr. Lantos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for a very cogent statement. Let me assure you that the department's request will be given very careful and very sympathetic consideration, as we have done in the past. You indicated, and we all know, that in the next few days, the UN Security Council will be at the focus of attention globally. Now, I think it's important for us to spend a minute and get your views of what, in fact, the United Nations is. The first legislative act of the House of Representatives yesterday evening was to pass a resolution overwhelmingly expressing our outrage at Libya's chairmanship of the UN Human Rights Commission, expressing our outrage that within a few weeks, Iraq, and I am sober, Iraq will be the chairman of the UN Conference on Disarmament. Now, I think it's sort of important for you as Secretary of State to make it clear to the American people that while the UN has many useful functions, it does not represent the conscience of mankind, and it does not represent a housekeeping seal of approval if they do something or if they fail to do something. As you know as well as I do, statistics show, public opinion surveys show, that there is a far greater support for action vis-à-vis Iraq if it is following a UN Security Council resolution or without a UN Security Council resolution. I think to some extent, with the best of intentions, we have been guilty in building up the importance of the UN in the public mind way above what it deserves. The UN is a useful instrument, but there are profound limitations on its usefulness. And as you have stated so often, the UN Security Council must demonstrate that it is still relevant. And if it is irrelevant, we must say so and proceed. As you know, many of us in this body are working for an alliance of democratic nations within the UN structure, nations which should have jobs such as chairmanship of the UN Human Rights Commission, rather than this absurd phenomenon of Libya, one of the prime violators of human rights globally, serving as chairman. I'd be grateful if you would share with us your view of the UN Security Council, and their relevance to what will happen in the next few weeks.
Mr. Lantos, obviously we were as outraged as you are and the members are over the fact that under the procedures of the UN trying to accommodate the desires, needs, wants of some 190-odd nations, I think it's 191 now, with regional groupings have put in place a set of procedures and rules over the years as to who gets to chair what committee. With respect to Libya chairing the Human Rights Commission, it is ludicrous. Nevertheless, the rules that were being followed teed that up. We fought it, and we voted against it, and we forced a vote so everybody could see who was in favor or not in favor of this.
And let the record show that only Canada and Peru stood with us.
Yes, Canada, I'm not less sure about Peru, but yes, only 3 nations voted for not seating Libya. The case of Iraq is even more outrageous in the sense that the Conference on Disarmament runs its chairmanship by alphabetical order. and Iraq, who's coming up in May, is probably going to get advanced to March because Iran would have come first, but it removed itself from consideration. And so Iraq takes over in March. Now, we'll see where we are in March, and a lot remains to be seen, but we have expressed our outrage over this, and we will do what we can to see if there's some way to break this accession to the chairmanship of the CD. And if we are unable to do that because of the rules of the UN, then we will act accordingly during the period that Iraq would be in the chairmanship, and we would simply find ways not to participate. With respect to the UN, I'm a great believer in and supporter of the United Nations. It is a complex organization, but I think you got to have something like it, and it has done remarkably good work over the years. It is not well suited to running a military operation, for example, but when you look at what it's done in other areas of peacekeeping, when you look at East Timor, when you look at Cambodia, you look at some of the things that have been done here in our own region, the United Nations has performed a valuable role. But it should not always be seen as you can't do anything unless the UN says you can do it. We have a lot of experience, Kosovo being a perfect example, where we acted in the absence of UN permission. When we defended our interest in Panama in 1989, the UN condemned us. We did what we had to do anyway with the Panama invasion. And so it should not be seen as a good housekeeping seal of approval. But at the same time, I think we have an obligation as the most powerful nation in the world to try to make our case before that body. And then let's see how that body responds to the case. And if I may, Mr. Lantos, many of our friends and closest allies, such as the United Kingdom, they do have more of a need for this kind of support, both as a legal matter in some circumstances, as well as a political and public matter, in order to join us in some of the efforts that we undertake.
Mr. Beerider.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your statement and your leadership. I wanted to inform you, Mr. Secretary, that in October of this past year, Congressman Berman and I initiated a letter to the President asking for a robust increase in the FY 2004 international affairs budget as a key component to our military and intelligence capabilities in the battle against terrorism, the effort to build global stability. That was signed by 103 members, including 26 people that you have before you here, and many of the members were not in the Congress or not on this committee, undoubtedly would be on that list as well. This follows the similar action last year, so I think that the charge that we're not supportive in any fashion for spending what is necessary, especially since it's being spent well under your leadership, is bogus, and I wanted you to have that reassurance. It includes the chairman and the ranking member, Mr. Lantos, as well. I am doing a few things you might guess on the NATO issue, and I won't go into details except we're going to try to reassure Turkey that failing to convince the 3 recalcitrant members, the House will express its intent to assist Turkey in its defense and enlist all the potential allies that we can in that effort. I want to particularly commend you for what you're attempting to do with respect to embassy construction. And I think that the initiative on capital security cost-sharing program, while on an interagency basis, complicated and contentious, is the right way to go. And if you need legislation, I'm sure that this committee would consider it and act expeditiously. That's my expectation. I also think that your effort to bring the State Department into the 21st century on information technology is certainly overdue and deserves our full support. With respect to the embassy construction, you may remember this is the first thing I came to talk to you about after you took over your job about 2 weeks into your tenure. And you expressed your confidence in General Williams, and I'm sure that was well placed. And the progress you've made is great. I still think, as you may know, that this half step, important as it is, needs to be followed by more steps, including potential for lease purchase and for turnkey operations. Serbia is one of the countries you've listed for a new embassy, and I walked through that embassy just after we were able to do that again. I'm glad that you have squelched any interest in the department about reconstruction. It's not feasible. So a new embassy absolutely is the way to go, and I hope that minuscule site that we have will not be considered for the new embassy, because you can't build a safe one there. Finally, I have two questions. The first one on Kosovo, the second on Afghanistan. I want to have a confirmation, if I could, that it has been the Clinton administration and the Bush administration policy that we are not encouraging independence for Kosovo at this point, since there is an effort being led by a former member to push the Congress for action on that. I'd like a confirmation that is our continued position. Secondly, on Afghanistan, I have felt that one of the keys to Afghanistan's success as a viable economic country, a democratic country, would be to restore its ability to feed itself, to focus on that rural economy and the fact they don't have any components to make it viable. So you might want to comment on that subject and whether or not the delay in appropriations for AID under FY 2003 has hurt our efforts. And finally, to suggest that perhaps your top person, the administrator, could explain to us what they're doing on rural development in Afghanistan as a part of an overall program. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
On Kosovo, sir, I reaffirm the policy. On Afghanistan, any delay in getting appropriated funds, especially the 2003 request, and it keeps us from doing the kinds of things we ought to be doing. We need to be pushing as much of the money that we have appropriated or plan to appropriate for Afghanistan into those programs. We've got to get the agricultural sector up as fast as possible, restoring irrigation systems. This is a country that can feed itself. This is a country that, if we can get the agricultural sector back up, will not only feed itself, but it will really help jumpstart the economy. So anything that can be done to get funds into the pipeline is very, very important to our efforts in Afghanistan, for that matter, many other places in the world. With respect to the rural development issues, I would like to provide for the record a better answer on that after talking to our AID folks. If I may just say, sir, on Turkey, Turkey will be defended. I mean, we have already determined how to do that. It'd be much better if NATO would act as a alliance on this and not allow itself to be tied up in knots by 3 of the 19 nations. But 16 nations are there, ready to act, ready to do the job. And I still have some optimism that we'll find a solution over the next 2 to 3 days. In my car driving up here, just a few moments before the hearing, I had another conversation with German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, who's about to enter a meeting with the French Foreign Minister to discuss this issue. So let's hope we can find a way forward on that particular issue. Thank you for your support of our construction efforts, and I will make sure that we've got the Serbian one under control. I just was showing these to the President this morning, Mr. Beretta. That's new embassy at Dar es Salaam in Tanzania that's just been opened, and Nairobi just been opened, and a wonderful facility that'll be opened in Istanbul, Turkey in the very near future as well in April. So these things are coming online. There's commonality of utilities. There are construction efficiencies that we are now starting to achieve, and I think we got this program well under control.
Mr. Berman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember, Mr. Secretary, when you came here 2 years ago, and you made it very clear your commitment to ensure that the downward spiral of funding for both the State Department's diplomatic operations and the foreign assistance program would not continue, and that, to the contrary, it would increase. And I think with the budget, notwithstanding my terrible distress at certain aspects of the President's budget, and Mr. Lantos made reference to it, the fact is, in the foreign relations function, with some questions still to be answered about to what extent assistance and Millennium Challenge account funding are double counted, it looks like you have made a serious reversal in that downward decline with this year's budget, and I think my own sense is that wouldn't have happened without your very strong efforts with the Office of Management Budget, and I think you're to be congratulated. But what I'd like you to do is to talk, once again, you must get tired of talking about it, but about Iraq. I believe in the correctness of what the administration is doing here and the pressure that it is applying in a very serious way to try and produce the desired result. But there is a reasonable and rational alternative, which many of my constituents, more than I'd like to see given my position, many of my constituents hold to, and other people do as well. And they say, we recognize that force sometimes has to be an option, and we recognize that the evidence is compelling and the recent history is compelling. He has weapons of mass destruction and missiles, and the evidence is clear that he's in material breach of the United Nations resolution. But the better course of action here is a course of containment and deterrence. That will do the job with less risks, with less potential dangers than what can possibly lead, things we can't anticipate, from the use of force. And that's the strategy. I think that argument fails, but I think you could point out more effectively than I've been able to why it fails, and I'd like you to take your shot at dealing with that argument.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. We have been applying containment for the last 12 years.
Yeah, but now you got the inspectors back. We only would have gotten them back by the using of force. Now you have people willing to talk more about what's coming into the country, and there was, people, now at last they're serious about it.
Yeah, and the only reason they're acting seriously,
Absolutely.
if one calls it seriously, is because there are, tens upon tens of thousands of U.S. troops who are heading their way. I mean, they didn't even think about letting the inspectors back in. They were just thumbing their noses at the UN from 1998 until the 14th or 15th of September of last year, 3 days after President Bush made his speech, and they said, oh my God, they're serious. How can we frustrate their desire to get our weapons of mass destruction? Let's let the inspectors back in. And they've been playing dribble ball ever since. Let the inspectors in, but don't show them anything. Okay, we got to show them something. Whoops, more troops are coming. Show them something. Do anything we can to frustrate the inspection effort while making it look like we're cooperating with the effort until the international community gets tired, until the United States gets tired of having troops mobilized, and everybody goes away and we're back to where we were before the President made his 12 September speech. The reason that no longer is viable is because even with 12 years of containment and deterrence, he kept moving forward. He continued to develop weapons of mass destruction. I was reading intelligence again this morning. There is no question that he is still trying to deceive. He is still trying to hide. Even after my speech last Wednesday, which pointed out a lot of this stuff, he is still at it. There's no change. So containment is not really working. He continues to develop these weapons of mass destruction. I wish it did work. But how do we know it will continue to deter him? How do we know, particularly in the post-9/11 environment, which I think really does fundamentally change things? You really cannot just leave a place alone now and think it's contained when you know that within that place they're developing weapons of mass destruction. And let's put it very directly, ricin. They have anthrax they haven't accounted for, botulinum toxin. They have mobile laboratories that we know of. We know that if they had a free hand and nobody was looking, or if they could figure out how to get out of the oversight of those who are looking, they would develop a nuclear weapon. Saddam Hussein has never lost his intent. He is contained only until he can get out of containment. And if we don't deal with this problem here and now, it will not go away. It will not remain contained. He will pop out of the box. And if we don't use the pressure we have been able to generate over the last several months, if we don't now force him to disarm, either peacefully, by cooperating with the inspectors, or by taking it away from him through the force of arms, then we will be dealing with this problem evermore. Now, everybody is concerned about the consequences. Terrible things are going to happen. There will be terrorism. We'll have all kinds of trouble in the region. But you know what? If we're successful, and we will be successful, we will have gotten rid of a dangerous regime. We will be putting in place a stable country in that part of the world. We'll use our military force. We'll use our humanitarian efforts. We are positioning humanitarian supplies. We're going to work with our friends and allies. We're going to work with the neighbors in the region. We'll be able to change the presence levels of American troops throughout that region in the absence of a threatening regime like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. We'll get up all the weapons of mass destruction, and we may find ourselves, instead of having more problems, but a lot fewer problems. Success could breed a lot of new opportunities rather than a lot of new problems. And so I would say to your constituents, Mr. Berman, that we have been containing for the last 12 years, but it isn't working, and we can't allow it to continue in this manner in the post-9/11 environment where these kinds of technologies, these kinds of weapons could be given to terrorists or provided to terrorists in some way or another, or stolen by terrorists, or terrorists get their hands on them, and then we are faced with the problem. And this is not hypothetical. The ricin that is bouncing around Europe now originated in Iraq. Now, not a part of Iraq directly under Saddam Hussein's control, but his intelligence people know all about it. There is cooperation taking place in the manner I described last week, and I have no reason to step back from anything I said last week. It's this nexus between weapons of mass destruction, states that are developing them, and cooperation with non-state actors such as Osama bin Laden or some other nutcase who might come along in due course. It's a risk that we strongly believe, the President strongly believes, and I think most members of the international community strongly believe we should not take any longer.
Mr. Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your extraordinary job you're doing on all of our behalf. Just a couple of questions on human rights and especially on hunger. As you know, there's more than 35 million people at risk in sub-Saharan Africa. Robert Mugabe has gotten so desperate that he recently signed an accord, or is in the process of signing one, with a Chinese firm to develop his farming, and I know we're trying to respond aggressively. Frank Wolf did brief many of us that you were very responsive on his return trip from Eritrea and Ethiopia and getting some of that food aid released that had been held up. So thank you for that. There is, as you know, a $250 million increase in the omnibus. Many of us would have hoped, and Chairman Hyde wrote a letter, we all backed him, hoping we would get to 500. Anything that could be done this late in the day to get that to 500 would be appreciated. On trafficking, you talked about, this public diplomacy and the fact that our aviators were watching your speech. We have a window of opportunity with regards to public diplomacy now to push the envelope, hopefully, notwithstanding the problems we have with terrorism and the amount of time that takes, but it shouldn't crowd out, obviously, other concerns and human rights concerns. We now know that there are at least 4 million, mostly women, who are trafficked, and that doesn't count the number of women in country, like in India, where there are so many young girls who are Indian who are being exploited by Indians. This year, after the TIP report is proffered by the administration to Congress, there will be a 90-day window that the President will have to make a decision, sanctions or not, on Tier 3 countries. It seems to me that right now our ambassadors ought to be raising the issue, especially in the Tier 3 countries. Get it right. Crack down the way people like Serbia did, for example, in raiding their brothels and releasing these women. And I would hope you would admonish our folks to do just that. And on refugees, several of us signed the letter. It was very bipartisan, asking that the ceiling be raised to 100,000. And finally, on justice, Rwanda Tribunal has 9 convictions. David Crane in Sierra Leone, it seems to me, is setting the model as to how a tribunal, regional or country-specific, ought to be done. And hopefully that could be replicated and looked at when we go to Iraq.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Let me touch very quickly on the points. On trafficking, it sounds like you were in my staff meeting this Monday morning when we talked about it. TIP reports coming up, third time sanctions flow. Get word out to all of our bureaus, all of our ambassadors to go into the Tier 3 countries and tell them showtime, and the law will require us to apply sanctions, so you got to get with it. With respect to hunger, it is a it is a challenge to the world to do something about this problem. Sub-Saharan Africa and the Horn of Africa and other places in the world. And when you take hunger and match it up against HIV, AIDS, and other infectious diseases, they feed on each other. Weakened people are not resistant to those kinds of diseases. And I will take all the money anybody wants to give me. There's a new famine fund for $200 million in the FY 2004 budget that I hope Congress will also support. And with respect to refugee admissions, we're having trouble. We're having trouble principally in the clearance of people to come into the country, as well as some problems of misrepresentation, where people are taking advantage of the refugee admissions program. And we're working on all of that. And I hope to meet the goal that we set for ourselves this year, but we've got to accelerate the admissions coming in.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for your presentation. New York remains even more proud of its favorite son. You bear a heavy burden, most of us believe, in probably being the most credible spokesman for our country and our policies, certainly around the world. And we want you to continue to make our case because you make it quite well. Listening to the ironies about who's chairing what committees at the UN, I think one of the total ironies raises the question of what are we going to do about France adopting a policy that they're totally opposed to U.S. military intervention. The strangeness of that is most of us believe that they'd all be speaking German today if it were not for U.S. military intervention, and that would be an intolerable humiliation for them, knowing how finicky they are about their language. You can answer that some other time. It seems to me, on a different note, Mr. Secretary, that we seem to be lacking a coherent policy against weapons of mass destruction and the means to deliver them. A few months ago, as you know better than anybody else, with the help of the Spaniards, a North Korean ship laden with Scud missiles was bound for Yemen. And the White House response to that was that there's no international law prohibiting the sale of North Korean missiles to Yemen, and so we let the ship proceed. Similarly, there doesn't seem to be any response to the allegations that Pakistan provided nuclear weapons-related technology to North Korea. Maybe we're going to sanction Pakistan, and maybe we won't. And lastly on that, we as a nation don't seem to be very concerned, at least outwardly, about the apparent speed with which Iran is pursuing its own nuclear weapons program. The first question I have is exactly what is our non-proliferation policy? And secondly, the proposed budget calls for $395 million for Pakistan for fiscal year 2004, and yet, as I understand it, the operation of current law would require the reimposition of democracy-related sanctions on Pakistan for the coming fiscal year, which carry a prohibition on any U.S. assistance. Is the administration going to seek authorization to waive the democracy sanctions on Pakistan in 2004? And similarly, it's my understanding that the administration hasn't yet exercised existing authority to waive democracy-related sanctions for fiscal year 2003, and that no 2003 money is being provided to Pakistan because of concerns with their relationship with North Korea and allegations in the press that Pakistan might have provided highly enriched uranium technology to North Korea in exchange for Scud missiles. Will the administration be making a decision on the various applicable sanctions provisions, including the democracy sanctions, the Glenn sanctions, Symington sanctions, as well as MTCR-related sanctions?
Our non-proliferation policy, Mr. Ackerman, is to do everything possible to stop the flow of technology, to stop the flow of equipment, to stop the flow of precursor materials, and to do everything we can to keep brain drain from going from those countries who have knowledge of such weapons to those countries who are trying to acquire such knowledge, and I touched on that briefly in my statement. With respect to Pakistan, we are reviewing all of the various sanctions legislation that has been in existence for a number of years, the democracy waiver, other waivers, Brownback II, a number of things that we are working our way through now. We will need the democracy waiver, which I think we will get back in the omnibus bill for 03, and then, of course, also 04 as well. The continuing resolution allowed us to use the waivers from 02 into 03 while we awaited the action on the omnibus bill. And, of course, we would ask for it in 04 as well, both for missile technology transfer and democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to request if you could give us, our committee, an intelligence briefing on what's going on.
Where are the requests? Yes, sir.
Lastly, with the balance of my time on in the Middle East, could you bring us up to date on the loan guarantee and military help that has been requested by Israel?
We're aware of the request that, of course, that the Israeli government has presented to us, and we're studying it, but no decision has been made and no action has been taken on the request at this time.
Chair recognizes Chairwoman Russ Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to add, no funny lines. I'd like to add my voice to the chorus of accolades that you are deservedly receiving today on their masterful presentation at the United Nations. We're very proud to have you represent our country in such a dignified manner. Following up on Mr. Ackerman's question, as the new chair of the Middle East Subcommittee, I'll be traveling to Israel on Friday, and I know that our counterparts are very worried about their survival as well as their economic stability and economic survival. Following up on Gary's question, the supplemental aid request, which is so needed for Israel. As you know, the last 2.5 years of Palestinian violence, the ever-growing threat on the Lebanese border, the impending action with Iraq, they've placed an incredible strain on the Israeli defense budget and its overall economy. And furthermore, as you know, the bursting of the high-tech bubble and the international economic slowdown has hit Israel particularly hard. And I wanted to know if you had any more specifics to add to Mr. Ackerman's question regarding the status of the possible U.S. multi-year assistance package of loan guarantees and military aid to Israel to help them weather the current economic and security crisis, and when that decision will be made. And following on to that, Mr. Secretary, although the Syrians might have been thought of as being helpful in the past in our war against terrorism, I hope that our administration does not turn a blind eye to the sum and substance of Syria's behavior as a result of some somewhat cooperative acts. Because Syria continues to support and allow groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and nearly 10 other groups to operate from Syrian territory. And I wanted to ask you about the status of Syria's extensive weapons of mass destruction program, specifically its chemical and biological weapons capability. And then related to Cuba, I'll throw that for the written part. I have two Cuba-related questions, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. With respect to the Israeli request, very sensitive to the difficult economic situation that Israel finds itself in after several years of the Intifada, and all of the issues you mentioned that relate to this. I might also add drop-off in tourism has also had an impact on the Israeli economy. And so we will review the request with seriousness, and we'll do it as quickly as we can. But I don't have an answer for you at this time as to what action the administration will be taking on that. With respect to Syria, they have been helpful in some aspects in the war against terrorism, and we are appreciative of that, but that has not kept us from engaging with them and being critical of their efforts with respect to supporting terrorist organizations. And we have also spent a lot of time with them discussing the need to keep things quiet on the northern border of Israel with respect to Hezbollah activities and to clamp down on those kinds of terrorist activities directed toward Israel. And we do not shrink from that kind of démarche simply because they happen to be cooperating in one aspect in the war on terrorism. We know that Syria has an interest in various weapons of mass destruction, and what I would like to do is, if you would like, ma'am, have the agency provide that to you in a more classified
Thank you so much. And my Cuba-related items would deal with praising the USAID program for a very strong proposal that they have put forth to help the independent libraries in Cuba, building solidarity with the human rights organizations and the growing dissident and opposition movement in Cuba, and I'll submit those in writing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
And I was pleased to meet with the leader of Villela recently.
So pleased that you did. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Faleoma Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and always a personal pleasure to welcome our Secretary of State here before the committee, Mr. Chairman, and I too echo the sentiments that have been expressed earlier by our colleagues to the outstanding leadership that you've demonstrated, Mr. Secretary, in serving our nation in such an important role and responsibility that you bear, not only for our nation, but certainly for the world. Mr. Secretary, shortly after World War II, our nation unilaterally declared certain Micronesian islands as a strategic trust. And we didn't even seek United Nations approval. We just went and grabbed these Micronesian islands. Our strategic and security interest in Micronesia became more apparent when our military presence in the Philippines and Subic and Clark Air Force Base were no longer needed. Even more critical at the height of the Cold War, our nation detonated some 67 atomic and hydrogen bombs in the Marshall Islands. And as a result, several hundred Marshallese men, women, and children were directly exposed to nuclear contamination. In short, Mr. Secretary, the administration's proposed 2004 budget gives no indication on the continued funding for the Federated States of Micronesia, and nor providing any assistance or compensation for medical health care for the Marshallese victims who were subjected to nuclear fallout. I would really appreciate, Mr. Secretary, if the administration will submit a proposed budgetary line item for this very important area. I realize there are not very many Micronesians out there, but they certainly are very critical as far as our strategic and military interests are concerned. I'm also glad, Mr. Secretary, that you have commented about the encouraging number of minorities that are making every effort to become members of our foreign service program there with the Department of State. 38%, that's pretty good. And I would continue to encourage the department to do so. Mr. Secretary, you, more than anyone in this room, knows more about this most critical issue that our nation and the whole world is confronted with, and that is whether our nation and the United Nations, for that matter, should wage war against Saddam Hussein and Iraq. I was about to ask about your consideration about containment as we did against Gaddafi of Libya, and I think you responded accordingly. Could it be possible also that the reason why the United Nations have been very passive for the past 10 years in enforcing these resolutions was because Saddam Hussein was no longer a danger as he was before or after when he took military control of Kuwait? I'm just passing that on for your consideration. But noted also on your statements that, as you had quoted from Karl von Clausewitz's statement, no one starts a war, or rather no one in his senses should do so, without first being clear in his mind and that he intends to achieve by that war and how he intends to achieve it. You give an indication that it's absolutely necessary for a nation to wage war. The military, the government, and the people must all act in unison. You cannot just depend on the military. All these three factors must come into play. I am not necessarily a fan of France and Prime Minister Chirac, especially when he violated our moratorium on nuclear testing in the South Pacific. By applying the standard that you've given suggestion to, Mr. Secretary, it's my understanding, if the media is correct, that 80% of the people in France do not support are going to war against Iraq. President Chirac also has about 6 million Muslims living in his country. So all these factors perhaps may have added into his problem in offering resistance And maybe there may be some other areas on how we can properly address Saddam Hussein's problems as we had dealt with him 10 years ago. But we talk so much about defending Turkey. Has the administration given serious consideration how we're going to defend Israel? I'm asking all kinds of questions, Mr. Secretary. And last, if 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council do oppose the idea of waging war against Iraq, what are the consequences? I'm sorry to give you all those questions, Mr. Secretary.
As you know, we're working on an amended compact legislative proposal that we'll submit later this spring. And the total economic assistance package for the area, I believe, is fair and adequate, $3.8 billion from 2004 to 2023. I'm sure you're familiar with as well, sir. With respect to your comment on my good friend Clausewitz and his thinking, which is my thinking, sometimes you can't just sit back and reflect public opinion. You have to lead in order to shape public opinion, and that's what I think President Bush has been doing, and I think the American people are responding to his leadership. And other nations have chosen not to try to lead the public opinion, or, you know, just maybe the view of President Chirac that he does not want to lead public opinion in that direction because he feels strongly in another direction. We liberated France, and we freed Germany as well from its dictatorial leadership of World War II so that they could free independent thinking nations. They're democracies. They have the right to determine what their positions will be. If these nations that do have a permanent seat on the Security Council, the United States, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and China, if any one of them vetoes, then the United Nations Security Council can't act. The President has made it clear that he reserves the right at that time to act with a willing coalition, as has happened on previous occasions in the past at the United Nations. With respect to Israel, same kinds of conversations that we've had with respect to the defense of Turkey, we have had with Israel, and actions have been taken.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Powell. You traveled to the African nation of Gabon last year to examine efforts being undertaken by its government to protect the forests and wildlife. And the administration has announced a Congo Basin initiative aimed at these environmental protection efforts in Gabon and in neighboring states there. Your ally in this effort, environmentalist Michael Fay, I wanted to mention to you, was gored by an elephant last month, but he reports that he is on the mend and looking forward to returning to his role of charting the rainforest and to leveraging those governments to set aside that national parks system for the Congo Basin Initiative. I was going to ask you if you wanted to explain to the members the initiative, a little bit about what it attempts to do in terms of protecting the environment there. I also wanted to say that later today our subcommittee, the one I chair, will be holding a hearing on the crisis in Ivory Coast. And that West African state is imploding. It's a victim of armed rebellion. One area in the region where we've had some success with considerable effort has been Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, where horrific atrocities were being committed, a measure of stability and hope has been established, but only through a major peacekeeping operation. Once at 18,000 troops, the largest in the world, backboned by British troops with support from Nigerians and others. Rebels aren't running around cutting off the arms and legs of little boys and girls there as a result, and this peace, however, is young and precarious, especially as long as Liberian President Charles Taylor, who backed the Sierra Leonean rebels, and I believe is backing rebels in Ivory Coast, is still in power. I wanted to make that point, and I hope we're not winding down that operation too quickly in Sierra Leone because the gains that have been made there could be lost quite quickly. I also wanted to just ask you on Zimbabwe, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the personal sanctions we tried to put in place on President Mugabe. There is a report coming out of Harare where, as you know, he's arrested the mayor of the city of Harare, the mayor of Bahaleo, and is replacing them with his own political people, they say, well, that's just hot air. So I wanted to ask about the sanctions, the status of those sanctions against Mugabe. I also wanted to express my appreciation for the administration's new departure on foreign aid with the Millennium Challenge accounts, with its emphasis on markets and rule of law and reform, and thank you for that.
Thank you very
Secretary.
much, sir. On the Ivory Coast, we stay in very close touch with my French colleague, Dominique de Villepin, and monitor his efforts. French have been in the lead on this, and I hope that as a result of efforts made by President Gbagbo in recent days, that is stabilizing a bit now, and we can see some forward movement. In Sierra Leone, the drawdown is taking place, but we'll monitor it carefully to make sure it isn't precipitous and leave a condition of vulnerability and fragility that is not warranted based on the situation. And I think we should be very proud that we were the major financial contributor to that peacekeeping effort during its height. With respect to Zimbabwe, sir, you've heard me speak about Mr. Mugabe and the disaster he has created in Zimbabwe in every way imaginable with respect to its economy, its agriculture, its political system, its human rights situation, and there is an issue of reimposition of sanctions. We'd certainly welcome that, and we are very unhappy that France, for example, has included Mr. Mugabe in some upcoming conference which essentially breaks out of the travel containment plan we had around him. With respect to the Congo Basin Initiative, for the benefit of all of the members, this is a terrific program that the United States is participating in with other nations and a number of non-governmental organizations and wildlife federations and the like, to set aside parts of Africa and around the Congo Basin for wildlife and to preserve this, so they're not exploited for oil, timbering, agriculture. And I was there last year to dedicate national forest in Gabon. President Bongo has set aside 10% of the whole country forever to be natural preserves. Michael Fay is a marvelous man, a naturalist, who walked the whole length of the Congo Basin. It's a wonderful series of articles in National Geographic, and he was recently gored by one of his elephants that he had yet to make friends with, obviously. But I'm very pleased to know that Michael is recovering well. The day I visited with Michael and he took me through his forest preserve, we were looking for animals and didn't see a one. My security had driven them all away, helicopters flying over, boats everywhere. There wasn't a mosquito in sight. And so I saw a lot of plants but no animals.
Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you. Just have a couple of quick comments regarding the situation in Iraq and then some specific questions regarding Africa. I do think that we have a very serious situation in Iraq. However, I still feel strongly that our number one problem is Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda terrorists who are terrorizing this country daily with all kinds of alerts that we have to be on. And I do feel that American people are getting a false sense of comfort by virtue of our going into Iraq and doing what we intend to do, that will have an impact on the threats of Osama bin Laden and terror. I don't think the two are really connected. I do believe that even in this tape that Osama bin Laden recently made, he even called Hussein infidel, socialist, you know. So I see this, I think that Osama bin Laden is the most dangerous person in the world. And I think that we ought to really be concentrating on that and need to be telling American people that these are two separate, his ragtag group of people that he gets from all over the country is totally different than the state of Iraq. And I think that Saddam Hussein is a bad person. I think that he should disarm. I think it would be good if he's out of power. But I think the more we co-link those two and make them one and the same, we do a disservice to the American people by giving them a false feeling of comfort as we go into Iraq. I do think, too, that we vilifying the ones who have, I listened to my colleagues trashing France and Germany, and I do think that we ought to, understand that there may be difference of opinion. I can't understand how Secretary Rumsfeld called them old Europe. I don't know what that means. I don't know what Great Britain is if the sun never set on the British Empire. I mean, what are they? So, I think we're dividing our potential allies unnecessarily. I mean, we should try to convince them that they ought to see it our way. We ought to even do a better job convincing American people. They ought to see it the way the President sees it. And you, however, to really bash these people at this time, I think that in the long run, I don't see it being very helpful. Also, on my good friend, Secretary of Defense, I was appalled by his saying when Congressman Rangel talked about reinstituting the draft, that I think Secretary Rumsfeld said, well, the draft never worked anyway. They were just a bunch of people that didn't, get the exemption, and I don't think very much about the draft. I feel very, very angered by the many draftees who served in the military throughout our decades, and I know you're not Secretary of Defense, but I thought I'd just mention that. Some of these statements, I don't see where it helps us at all. Just getting on to, with the U-2s and the French Mirages and the Antonov from Russia that they said they're allowed to come in, do you think that would be of any assistance that in that whole theater? That's about all that I'll ask on that. Just quickly, let me just say about Africa. One, I was pleased to hear the President talk about $10 million in new dollars. However, I'm hoping it's not reprogrammed money. There has been a 50% reduction in 04 budget for peacekeeping from 02. And I just question in Africa, with a tremendous reduction in the peacekeeping, many of the fragile democracies, or the Sierra Leone and those other areas that we have that we help to support peacekeepers, it looks like a lot of good work that we've done may go to naught if we defund that. Secondly, I think that the reduction in aid to Africa, where you've got probably 10 times more Muslims in Africa than you have in all of the Arab countries put together, to me, we need to be paying more attention to Africa in general, where we are seeing the Christian-Muslim question coming up in Nigeria and other places, even Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea. And so I would hope that with the increase, with the fact that Africa has been decreased in overall funding is disturbing to me, and I just wonder if you could touch on that situation.
Very quickly, Mr. Payne, first, with respect to al-Qaeda and Iraq, we start our day everywhere in the administration. Every senior leader gets a threat matrix of what we're facing. It's the first thing the President looks at. We focus on al-Qaeda and the kind of terrorist threats this nation faces as the #1 item. But that isn't to say, however, that we can't also deal with a problem like Iraq. And we are not neglecting any of our obligations with respect to al-Qaeda or the war on terrorism. And we have been seeing some success. They're still out there. They're trying to regroup. But with each week that passes, we find another cell detected and broken up. Some of them broken up by our best friends in Europe who we're having fights with about Iraq. We're still cooperating on al-Qaeda. And so I don't think that's the case. And it's not that we are trying to find a connection between al-Qaeda and Iraq. It's there. It's not something we're making up. It's there, and we can't fail to take note of it or to talk about it or to report it. With respect to Mr. Rumsfeld on the draft, I do have to say a word about this. The morning that this was reported, and I was driving to work, and I saw this little squib in the Washington Post suggesting that Don had said something unkindly toward Vietnam draftees. I just looked at it and said, this can't be. Don would not have said anything like this. So as soon as I got to the office, I went to my new State Department internet computer, and I went to the DOD website, and I pulled down Don's transcript. And Don was in no way trying to disparage anyone who had served their nation as a draftee. He was making a point on the personnel system and personnel flows, and how with draftees you get people in, they serve well, they serve nobly, but they leave. It is not part of the sustaining base of the military. That's the context in which he was speaking. And I think I called him that morning, and I said, hey, Don, you better get ready for this one, because people are going to read this little squib and think that's what you said. And when he looked at it, he called me back and said, my God. And he corrected it quickly in his statements and by putting out a letter to the Veterans Organization. Secretary Rumsfeld served in active duty and was in the reserves for decades. And he knows full well the contribution made to our nation by both those who served voluntarily or those who responded to the call of their nation under the draft. With respect to U-2, Mirages, and MiGs, we can use all the help we can get, but it has to be in the context of Iraq cooperating and Iraq complying. Otherwise, we're just adding more to the detective hunt, and that's what this is not about. With respect to Africa, overall, there is a 4.1 increase in the amount of funds we're asking in 2004, but it may not be uniformly an increase in every one of the individual country accounts or functional accounts, but we'd be happy to give you more information for the record, Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much.
Mr. King.
Mr. Secretary, I want to again commend you and the President for the tremendous leadership you've shown on this whole issue of Iraq and foreign policy across the board. Also, if I may, just for a moment before I ask my question, I'd like to comment on something my good friend Mr. Lantos said, with whom I usually agree. But on this one, I just would like to make the point, when he spoke about the President asking for sacrifice and bringing in the question of tax policy, which can be debated in another forum. But I would like to point out that it was President Kennedy who called on the country to bear any burden or make any sacrifice, and at a time when the Berlin Wall was going up and there's a Cuban Missile Crisis and our military strength in Vietnam was being increased by 200%, and we were trying to put a man on the moon, President Kennedy proposed the largest tax cut in history. The same arguments were made because most of the money went to those at the top. The fact is the tax cut did work. And I only point that out to show that as we do go forward, there's going to be many years of this war on terror, good Americans can have honest differences of opinion as to military policy, diplomatic policy, and also economic policy. And no one's motive should be questioned, and no one should be questioning the extent to which sacrifice is being called for. Now, my question to you, Mr. Secretary, is I think a follow-up on what Congressman Hyde was saying, and that's the extent of our obligations around the world. The fact that the President has said time and again that we're involved in a war which could go on for many years, in many ways, perhaps different from any war we fought before. So the American people are going to be called to stand with the President as Commander-in-Chief. And I think that the average American, whether they're pro-war or anti-war, whatever their gut feeling is, they're willing to stand with a Commander-in-Chief. But they have to feel that we're getting a fair shake out of this. And when they see a place like South Korea, where we have 37,000 troops, and we are being criticized by the new president of South Korea, where they see a situation like Germany, where we still have troops in Europe, and the Germans seem to be turning their backs on us, I'm not saying we should spite ourselves by pulling troops out, but I think it's important as we do go forward in the years ahead that the American people be convinced that every troop we have overseas is really in the interest of the United States. Because when you realize that in South Korea, those 37,000 could suffer catastrophic losses in the first hours of an attack from the north. And if we're asking Americans to make that sacrifice, what are we getting in return from South Korea? Is it really in our national interest to keep our troops there? I'm not saying whether it is or not, but I'm saying I think the American people have to be assured of that. The same when it comes to a place like Germany, and they see American troops there. So if we could, as we go forward with our foreign policy, and you've done a masterful job, I think it's important, though, if I can look beyond Iraq, that as future sacrifices are being asked and future engagements are going to be entered into, that the American people know that we're not being played for suckers by certain countries. I was listening to a debate the other day with a French reporter, and he was saying, what's the big excitement about Turkey? Because whether or not NATO provides this protection, we know the United States is going to provide it anyway. And it's almost that feeling that they can take shots at us, they can turn their back on us when we need them, but they know that in the end we're going to do the job. And again, I'm not saying we should spite ourselves, but again, I would just ask to have that type of evaluation and that type of statement made to the American people so they know exactly where we're coming from, and every dollar that's being spent and every potential American life that's being put at risk is there for the purpose of the United States and not for Chancellor Schroeder or not for the new president of South Korea. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. King. If I just respond briefly, the president-elect of South Korea is very supportive of U.S. presence. He has reaffirmed the desire of the South Korean people and of his administration when it takes office in 2 weeks' time to keep a strong American presence. We may want to take a look at exactly how we're distributed on the peninsula, but they want us there. Even after unification, when it comes, they want U.S. to remain because they know that U.S. presence on the peninsula and in the region is stabilizing for the region. It's in their interest, and it is also in our interest. President No, the new President-elect No, visited with the U.S. commander 10 days ago. He's been visiting with our troops. He has been demonstrating to the South Korean people that we are partners with them. The United States and South Korea are together. There will be these disagreements. There will be demonstrations from time to time, but I think the alliance between the United States and South Korea remains strong. We are working with them now to find a way forward on the North Korean nuclear problem, and I still am optimistic that we will find a way forward. With respect to Germany, there's a lot of angst right now. There's a lot of concern over the position that Germany has taken with respect to Iraq, but Germany is still a close friend of the United States, an ally of the United States. Some of the people who are most critical of our policies right now with respect to, say, Iraq are also very, very pro-American. They speak out in defense of the partnership between Germany and the United States. When we were looking for a country to take over leadership of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, the Germans stepped forward. The Germans are doing things in other parts of the world working with us. The Germans went to their legislature, the Bundeswehr, and got changes in their law so that they could participate in out-of-area operations. And so while we are focusing right now on this problem on Iraq, I don't think we should ignore all of the areas of cooperation that have existed between us and Germany over the years, and the fact that we do remain friends, partners, allies. They appreciate what we have done for them over the last 50 years. I started my career there. I kind of ended my military career there as well. And I know that there is still this residual deep feeling for America, feeling of friendship and appreciation. That does not mean that they will not disagree when there is something they want to be, shall I put it, disagreeable about. And so in the heat of debate and argument, I don't think we should throw out all the past and what I still think will be a promising future of the
Thank you, Mr.
alliance.
Secretary. And again, I thank you for the terrific job you're doing and for the way you represent both our country and our state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, let me join the chorus of voices that have complimented you in the service to our country.
Thank you.
There are some questions, though, that I'd like to ask. I think there are important questions in the context of the national debate as we approach a looming war in Iraq. There are questions that should be asked and answered as simply, as clearly, and as honestly as we can to the American people. And I think that those questions can be summed up in 4 parts. How many lives will be lost if we are to engage militarily in Iraq? How much will it cost the American taxpayers? How long will we be there after we defeat Saddam Hussein? I have no doubt that that will be done, but how long will we be there, and exactly what are our plans while we are there? And is this not, as we are doing in Afghanistan, nation building, something that I heard my colleagues for the past decade that I have been here rail against on the floor and in this committee about America's role in being part of nation building? And it certainly seems to me, from everything I've heard to date from the administration, that in essence part of our obligations both in Afghanistan and possibly in a post-Saddam Hussein Iraq will be about nation building. What exactly does that mean? So I'd like to hear some of your responses to that. And then the second set goes to the Western Hemisphere, of which I'm the ranking member. This budget is totally unacceptable in the context of the Western Hemisphere. It has been unacceptable for several years now, going between this administration and past administrations. But the President's budget increases law enforcement and military support for the region, while at the same time decreasing the hemisphere's development and humanitarian assistance. Child survival health programs receive very little new funding. The requested levels for development assistance for nearly $24 million, a 9% decrease. The administration's request for economic support funds for the regions is 48% lower than its request in fiscal year 02. And yet, we'll have a 1,000% spike in the FMF account, primarily to defend the pipeline in Colombia. Now, when I see what is happening in the hemisphere, of which I think we have not paid the attention that we should, we have tremendous economic difficulties in Argentina. We have very serious social unrest in Venezuela. We have the continuing problems of Colombia. We have significant difficulties in Brazil, and I'm only touching the surface of some of those difficulties. And we look at what is happening in the hemisphere in these countries, both in terms of social, economic unrest, and what that unrest creates in the context of breeding grounds and opportunities for terrorism right here in our back or front yard, however you may look at it, in the context of this hemisphere. And I see what we're doing in terms of this budget in the Western Hemisphere, and I say, boy, how short-sighted this is. And I know that there's always going to be the question of resources, but it's a question of also prioritizing in those resources. And I clearly believe that we treat the hemisphere as a stepchild against our national interests, and I would venture to say even against our national security interests. So I'd like you to address that. And lastly, I'd like you to address how much of the Millennium Challenge accounts, the $1.3 billion or so, is going to be dedicated to Latin America and the Caribbean. And I look forward to your answers, Mr. Secretary.
On the first set of questions, Mr. Menendez, I don't know how many lives would be lost in a conflict. I know that our military, as they plan for such a conflict in the hope that it may never occur, are taking actions and developing their plans in such a way to minimize the loss of U.S. and coalition lives, as well as minimize the loss of civilian lives of Iraqi citizens. It will depend, frankly, on the resistance that is put up by the Iraqi forces. It might collapse quickly, they might collapse quickly, or it may be a more prolonged conflict, particularly if you get into some sort of siege situation in Baghdad. And it is simply not possible, certainly not for me, and I wouldn't have made an estimate even when I was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because you cannot give a solid estimate to a question such as that. The dollar amount also I cannot answer at this point, because so much depends on the length of a conflict and the length of the work that has to be done afterwards. But it's going to be a considerable amount of money, and we should not shrink from that realization or pretend it can be done in the cheap. How long after is also in a similar vein. A lot depends on how long it takes to get out the infection of the Saddam Hussein regime and get down to, good baseline and put in place a responsible leadership. People talk about reconstruction as if the place is a devastated area now or we're going to devastate it. We didn't devastate it during the Gulf War, and I don't expect we're going to devastate it if there is a conflict in the future. Most of the infrastructure will be intact. The plans that we are looking at for the after would include using the institutions that are there, but purged of Saddam Hussein's cohorts, and build on what's there and put in place a new government and get out as fast as we can. But we should be under no illusions that we're going to be able to take over the country one day and have no responsibilities for it the next day. We will have to stay there with coalition partners and with the international community and provide for the Iraqi people until a responsible form of government can be put in place. And that's going to take some time. I can't tell you how long, but it isn't going to be a matter of a few weeks. It's going to be longer than that. With respect to nation building, there is a nation there. What it has is a rotten leadership. It's a nation that has wherewithal, $20 billion a year in oil revenue. It has an educated population. They are traders, they are entrepreneurs, they are bureaucrats. And I think all of that gives us a base to build on, unlike some of the other places we've dealt with over the years, such as Afghanistan, where truly there was total deconstruction of the society and of the infrastructure that we are now rebuilding. With respect to WHA, the overall level is $1.576 billion in our request, up from $1.54 billion in our 03 request. Developmental assistance is $404 million. There have been some puts and takes. It's less than it was last year, and I need to pursue that in greater detail and give you detail for the record. With respect to the Millennium Challenge account, we have not allocated it out to a particular region. It'll be a function of those countries that meet the criteria that we're establishing and who has the best game plan moving forward with respect to democracy, the rule of law, the end of corruption, economic development, and investing in their human potential and their human capital. With respect to the countries you've touched on, we have been not ignoring our responsibilities with any of the countries, especially with respect to Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. I participated in OAS meetings just recently to create the Friends of Venezuela to work with the Secretary General of the OAS in finding a way forward. And I think we've seen some progress in recent weeks. We worked hard to find an IMF solution for Argentina recently. President Lula was here, and we're working with Brazil to help them. And I was in Colombia in December to spend time with President Uribe and all of his ministers on his new comprehensive, solid plan to move forward and to see how we can best help him, and we are helping him financially. So even though there are challenges around the world, we are focusing in all of the accounts that you mentioned, all of the Western Hemispheric accounts that you mentioned, both with financial aid where appropriate and certainly with political assistance and diplomatic support as appropriate.
Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us here today. And you're doing a wonderful job on behalf of our nation, and we all wish you well as you continue to do your work at this critical time in world history. I want to compliment you on your address to the UN Security Council last week. You made a very compelling argument and presented detailed evidence that Saddam Hussein continues to develop weapons of mass destruction. History has clearly taught us that we cannot permit a murderous tyrant like Saddam to discard agreements he has made with the international community and continue to build his arsenal. And it's unfortunate that some of our nominal allies do not agree. It troubles me, as one with the surname of Shabbat, or the French pronunciation Chabot, to say this, but one would think that the French, of all people, would be quick to understand the high price of appeasement. Let me change course for a moment, Mr. Secretary. I just returned from Taiwan, where I was joined by Chairman Emeritus Gilman, several of my colleagues from this committee, Mr. Rohrabacher, Mr. Wexler, and Ms. Berkeley, and many other members of the Taiwan caucus. While in Taipei, we had the honor of meeting with President Chen Shui-bian, with Vice President Liu, with former President Lee Teng-hui, and as you know, each of these individuals has a remarkable life story. President Lee is called the father of Taiwanese democracy. President Chen once served several months in a penitentiary for criticizing the government. Vice President Liu was sentenced to 12 years in prison for giving a 20-minute speech on human rights. Each of these statesmen has played a major role in the growth of democracy. Yet due to the opposition from the communist dictatorship in Beijing, these world leaders have not been allowed to make official visits to the United States, the cornerstone of world democracy and freedom. Taiwan, of course, is an important player in Asia, and during these uncertain times, it can be of great help to the international community. I hope, Mr. Secretary, as we move ahead, our government will reassess its policy and permit our Taiwanese friends to come to our nation's capital on official visits. I accompanied about 25 of my colleagues to New York City, where we met with President Chen Shui-bian because he couldn't come to Washington. And we think, just think it's absurd that they can't come here, and we hope that we would again look at that policy. Finally, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you again for your work on the issue of international parental child abduction. You have been very gracious, and were gracious enough to meet with me and a left-behind parent from Cincinnati, Mr. Tom Sylvester, and we appreciate your efforts very much. I hope you can stay in touch with us on this matter and hopefully make some progress on this unfortunate case. We thank you for your good work to date and hope we can continue to count on your support. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, and if you have any comment on any of those issues, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you very much, sir, and I appreciate your kind words. With respect to Taiwan, we are constantly reviewing our policies, but we have to make sure our policies are coherent and consistent with our obligations with respect to our One China policy and with respect to the various communiques that go along with that, but also consistent with our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act, and I know you understand that. On child abduction, I spent a lot of time on this. I'm very moved by the visit I had with Mr. Sylvester. We followed that case, and new Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs, Maura Hardy, is all over this. She created the child office in the Department of State some years ago, and in her first few months as Assistant Secretary of State, she has gone after these kinds of issues. And I think what we have done in a number of countries recently to rescue children who have been abducted shows the commitment that she has made to this effort, and we will continue to make a commitment to this effort. She's also traveled to Saudi Arabia, and she's traveling to other parts of the world where we have had difficulty with these abduction cases to press our case home. I must say that she was criticized in certain quarters rather severely and unfairly as she went through the nomination process, but her record of accomplishment in her first few months of service will wash out all of that criticism rather quickly.
We have the Secretary till 1 o'clock, I'm told, and so we'll try to be mindful of that. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. When our nation's deciding what to do in Iraq, it seems the fundamental question that people are asking is, does a preemptive attack without UN support make the United States safer, make our civilians here and abroad safer? Some 3 4-star generals testifying in the Senate last fall said that a preemptive attack without UN support would, in the words of one of them, supercharge al-Qaeda recruiting. The CIA analysis of last fall talked about blowback, that if we attack unilaterally, if we attack without UN support preemptively, that there's a much greater chance of an attack on the American civilian population if you back Saddam into a corner. That's pretty clear that common sense would say that. I want to shift, though, to something else. While no mention has been made that I've heard from this administration of something that every schoolboy and every schoolgirl in America seem to know, and that is the links between the Saudi Arabian government and al-Qaeda, because they're our friends. But the administration has tried pretty unconvincingly to me, and it seems not particularly convincingly to the American people, to tie these, to establish ties between al-Qaeda and the Iraqi government. The President and the State Department are touting the Osama bin Laden tape released yesterday as an inarguable link between al-Qaeda and Iraq. In that recording, bin Laden states, quote, "The war concerns Muslims regardless of whether the Socialist Party and Saddam remain or go." My question is twofold. First, in that tape, bin Laden does not praise Saddam Hussein, actually, as his own words reveal, a marked indifference to whether Saddam and his regime lives or dies. You, Mr. Secretary, said 16 months ago that Osama bin Laden, quote, "doesn't care one whit about Iraq." I think that's still pretty clear. There has been no collaboration. There's been no proven or no evidence of real collaboration between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Second, it's well known that bin Laden despises Saddam Hussein. If the U.S. attacks the differences in religion, clearly Osama bin Laden despises the secular state of Iraq and the leadership from Saddam Hussein in that way. So if the U.S. attacks Iraq preemptively without UN support, I would offer and ask your comment that bin Laden succeeds on 4 fronts. Number one, there will be U.S. casualties of war, something Osama bin Laden would be thrilled with. Second, Saddam Hussein's regime, which is not fundamentalist enough for bin Laden's liking, is likely toppled, number two. Number three, al-Qaeda will gain thousands of terrorist recruits to attack the free world in reaction to a Middle East conflict, and especially a Middle East conflict where Al Jazeera televises every Iraqi civilian death throughout the Arab world. And fourth, our own CIA talks about blowback, which again plays into Osama bin Laden's hands. So it seems, Mr. Secretary, here's my question, if the U.S. attacks preemptively without UN support, doesn't that actually serve bin Laden's interests more than it does our own?
No, I don't think so. First of all, if it's necessary to attack, I'm sure there will be disturbances. I'm sure there will be some blowback, as you mentioned, and that is to be expected. But we can't say that because there's going to be blowback, we shouldn't act either with or without UN permission. If we think it is necessary to remove this regime because they're developing weapons of mass destruction, then we will have to accept some risk in doing that. I also think that after we have dealt with this regime, and we have been successful, which we will be, and when the people of the world and the people of the region realize that we have not come to impose our will on a Muslim state, but to come help people. There is no love lost for Saddam Hussein anywhere in that region, and I would submit even with Osama bin Laden. What makes the connection between Osama and bin Laden and Saddam Hussein interesting, and between Iraq and al-Qaeda interesting, is because they have found something that they do have in common, and that is a desire to hurt America, and they see ways of cooperating with each other in that Iraq is a potential source of weapons.
Are we bringing them, Mr. Secretary, are we bringing them closer together?
No, I think what's bringing them closer together is their common hatred of the United States and the nexus between terrorist organizations who would love to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. But guess what? If there ain't no Saddam Hussein there, if there isn't any Iraqi regime there, if there's a different kind of leadership that does not have any weapons of mass destruction, then we'll go back to the natural hostility that would exist between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, or especially Osama bin Laden and a responsible regime, a responsible leadership in Baghdad that did not have any weapons of mass destruction of any interest to Osama bin Laden. If Osama, even in my testimony last week before the Security Council, I made the point that we have this secular state and this religious fanatic, if that's what one would call Osama bin Laden. What they have found common of interest is this nexus between terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. And that's why we find, guess what, lieutenants of Osama bin Laden getting in touch with Hussein operatives. That's why we see al-Qaeda-linked organizations operating out of Baghdad, the Zakawi case that I mentioned last week. So it is that nexus that we are trying to break up, as well as break up Saddam Hussein's ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. So yes, we do have to face the possibility of blowback and disturbances, and we're preparing ourselves for that. But I believe in the aftermath of a successful operation, these problems will be dealt with and mitigated, and we'll be in a stronger footing, both within the region and with respect to the war against terrorism.
Mr. Tancredo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It does seem like, in listening to my colleagues and others, that part of our oh, by the way, dittos. You're a great guy, and we're doing a wonderful job, and all that.
Ditto, ditto.
That's it. I'm instituting the Rush Limbaugh time-saving factor here. It does seem, however, that one of our problems with a public policy that is difficult to explain, and maybe where we're losing in terms of that particular aspect of our endeavor, is that we keep identifying the problem here and the enemy here as an individual, sometimes guy by the name of Osama bin Laden, an organization, sometimes we call it Al-Qaeda, and a government or a country, sometimes we call it Iraq, as opposed to, I think, what our real enemy is, and that is, of course, fundamentalist Islam. And regardless of whether or not we are able to accomplish our goals in each one of those specific areas, dealing with each one of those, either individuals or countries, we can't tell the American people that everything will be okay afterwards, because there's a bigger, broader problem. And that's one of the things I think that's happening here it's confusing people, the American public and even our colleagues. But let's see. One of the things I wanted to mention, Mr. Secretary, goes away from this area entirely, and that is that about a month ago, I initiated a letter to you, I think signed by a dozen or so of my colleagues, specifically asking about a problem that I see developing around the country, and that is that the Mexican government has tasked all of its 40-odd consular officials with the responsibility of going out and actually lobbying states, cities, municipalities, counties for the purpose of getting them to accept the matricula consular, the Mexican ID. Essentially, when it boils down to it, they're doing is asking these levels of government to help people violate the law, because, of course, as you know, the only people here who need a foreign ID is someone who is here illegally. So I'm not asking you to respond to that today necessarily, unless you're inclined to, but to just respond to the letter that we sent, because it's been a month and I haven't heard anything. And the last thing is that a year ago you did mention that while you were here, you said something that it was certainly quotable, and I did quote it, and so did a lot of other folks, and that is that something to the effect that there was no greater human rights tragedy or disaster on the face of the earth than what was happening in Sudan. The U.S.-sponsored Civilian Protection Monitoring Team this week issued a report accusing the government of Sudan of deliberate attack against civilians in western Upper Nile and in violation of the IGAD-sponsored Cessation of Hostilities Agreement. As you know, we passed the Sudan Peace Act and authorized $300 million for reconstruction and development in Sudan beginning in fiscal year 2003. The President has requested an estimated $82 million in assistance for Sudan. And what I'm wondering is, are the requested funds for southern Sudan or for Sudan, and are they tied to a final peace settlement? And what are your observations about what's happening today, this minute in Sudan, and what can we do about it?
With respect to your letter, you'll get an answer very promptly, Mr. Tancredo. And we are reviewing the whole concept of the matricula consular to see what needs to be done about that. And I'm aware of the lobbying efforts that are taking place. With respect to Sudan, I'll give you an answer for the record on how the money is being spent or what our plans for the money are. I think we have made some progress with the IGAD effort in recent months. We've got discussions taking place now. It's been 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards for most of the last 2 years that we've been in there, but after that we've been in office. But I think we owe a lot to Senator Danforth for his effort, and we're following up in his effort. He remains engaged, and we believe we have seen some progress toward finding a way forward, but we've still got a very long way to go in the Sudan. But I'm a little bit more optimistic this year than I was last year.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for an outstanding opening statement that described our position in the world. I'd also like to commend the ranking member for his opening statement, particularly the portions praising the efforts of our Secretary of State. We're here to talk about the budget, but there are more important things even than the State Department budget. And I hope that you could respond perhaps in writing to a few comments I have about your budgetary proposal. First, you've got over $500 million for broadcasting. I commend you for that effort. I would hope to see an even larger portion of that budget for broadcasting go in broadcast aimed at the Muslim world, and aimed not with shortwave radio, but rather with AM, FM television, and especially satellite broadcasting. Second, I note with regret that Your proposal cuts from $15 million down to $7.5 million money for Cyprus, which is spent chiefly on intercommunal efforts, and I hope that we here in Congress push that back up to the $15 million that we provided last year. You spoke with pride about our efforts to build new embassies, and I'm thinking that perhaps it may be appropriate to build a new NATO headquarters since NATO faces its greatest threats in the southeast portion of the NATO area, and Brussels just seems way too far from that, not only geographically, but perhaps psychologically as well. You know, Mr. Secretary, that I've taken a great interest in spouses coming to live in the United States when an American citizen marries someone from a foreign country. And we've added Section 233 to the State Department authorization bill that provides a 30-day processing period as your goal, and I want to commend the State Department for its good faith efforts to achieve that. Unfortunately, the INS can take a year or years when there's no doubt that it's a legitimate marriage, when there's no issue of national security. They can separate a married couple for well over a year, and what's shocking is that they're doing so in part to enforce a law that says that if an American marries someone from a foreign country, they cannot live together in the United States until they prove that they're not poor. And perhaps that would be difficult to explain from a human rights perspective, that we believe in the permanent separation of husbands and wives if they happen to be poor and one happens to be an American. But I want to focus and give you a chance to respond with regard to the national security threats. 13 months ago, the President showed incredible perception and incredible non-diplomatic honesty in identifying 3 nations in the axis of evil. And my concern is that all of our attention is on only one of those 3 axi. I would feel, and I think my constituents would feel, a lot more secure if we had Hans Blix in 3 places rather than the 101st Airborne in Baghdad and virtually nothing but angry rhetoric directed toward North Korea, and perhaps nothing at all directed toward Iran. What I wonder is whether we would be in a better position to secure the economic sanctions that could cause a disarmament of North Korea if we were more compromising, perhaps even more compromising than would be optimal, on the issue of Iraq. Do we have a better chance of getting China to stop providing aid to North Korea and loans and low-cost exports to North Korea if we take a somewhat different position with regard to Iraq? Or are these, in effect, 3 separate problems, and can we craft our Iraqi policy independent and without regard to our concerns about Iran and North Korea?
I think we can craft them separately. I speak rather regularly to my Chinese colleagues about North Korea. I had a long meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister last week and expect to see him in the not too distant future. And they see it separately. They're not measuring what they might or might not do in North Korea with respect to what we are doing in Iraq. We are doing everything we can to persuade the Chinese that the problem in North Korea is not just a problem between North Korea and the United States. It is between North Korea and the region, and North Korea and the world. Earlier today, the International Atomic Energy Agency, meeting in Vienna, decided to report North Korea's noncompliance and North Korea's ignoring of the last resolution of the IA to the Security Council. And we're all united in that effort for the most part, to include China. And so I think China understands that it has an issue with North Korea too, because the Chinese position is the Korean peninsula will be denuclearized. So we're saying to them, fine, then why do you just turn to us to make it happen? You should be a part of this effort. And since you provide half of your foreign assistance to North Korea, of your annual foreign assistance, and 80% of energy and 80% of economic activity is from China, you have leverage that we would think it would be in your interest, as well as our interest and the interest of the region, to use. And we're pressing the Chinese with this case, and we are hopeful that they will respond. So I think the two issues are separable. With respect to Iran, different set of issues there. We are talking to our Russian colleagues, I did as recently as yesterday, over the announcement from Iran that they intend to have a full nuclear fuel cycle for their power generation needs, and that will include the ability to generate fuel that can be used for reprocessing into nuclear material. And we find this troublesome, and we are working with the Russians to help us bring this under control. Iran is undergoing a great deal of turmoil right now between those forces one might call moderate and those who one might call extremist. And we are encouraging moderates. We think that change will take place in Iran, but it is not a situation that seems at this moment to us to be appropriate to start threatening anyone or to get moving down a track of the kind we have in either Iraq, and it's quite different from the track we're on in North Korea. Even though there are similarities in terms of their desires to have weapons of mass destruction and the actions they've been taking in that regard, each has to be dealt with a different set of tools from a very large toolbox that we have.
The gentlelady from the 1st District of Virginia, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. First, let me say I'm sorry I missed most of your verbal statement, but I did read your written statement. I was meeting with the Speaker's Drug Task Force and President Gutierrez from Ecuador, which brings me to a question that there's a key position in the State Department in support of the overseas war against narcotics that's been vacant for nearly 6 months. And I was wondering if you could tell us when the International Narcotics and Law Assistant Secretary position will finally be filled? That's my first question. Second question is, a lot in the media here lately, and we've heard it somewhat with our colleagues here today, we hear that the transatlantic relationship over the last 50 years has really eroded, particularly with the core values that we've held with Europe that has held us together as allies. I was wondering if you could tell us where you see our transatlantic relationship going. How do you see it today?
On the first issue, there are two good candidates for the position, and the decision is imminent. So we should have somebody nominated for the position in the very near future. With respect to the transatlantic relationship, it's changing, it's evolving. We went from 16 members of NATO to 19 members of NATO, and we will be going to 26 members of NATO in due course. The European Union is growing in size by at least 10 nations or so, and I find myself spending as much time with the European Union leadership as I do with the NATO leadership. We have added so many countries to the transatlantic community over the last 10 years since the end of the Soviet Union, so one would expect evolution to take place. But what I find to be a common thread through this evolutionary process and period is a desire on the part of all of the nations of Europe to have a good relationship with the United States and to recognize that ultimately their security rests on the commitment of the United States to transatlantic security. Now, one of the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union is that all of these nations are now democracies. And democracies have people who vote. People have opinion. All these leaders now have public opinion. And so this may sound a little odd, but it was easier to work with opinion than it is with 12.5 countries. But I would want it no other way. But it also means more time has to be spent listening, cajoling, debating, not unlike what happens in Congress at a hearing, or perhaps even when you're behind closed doors. One never knows. Democracy isn't the easiest system in the world, especially when it's in a coalition. And so a lot of my time is spent arguing, debating, and not just saying, I'm America, we're the strongest, you got to do it our way. I want to hear what the smallest country thinks. I want to listen to that foreign minister and hear what he or she has to tell me about the aspirations, fears, anxieties of their people. Because we're the largest and because we are the most powerful, that places an obligation on us to listen and to use our power with care and with understanding and with restraint, but when it comes time to use our power in the right cause, to use that power. And so I think we are mindful of the views of others, considerate of the views of others, but we have principles we stand on, and we have things we believe in strongly and feel strongly about. And we should not be afraid to act strongly when we have strong views and strong principles that we are executing on.
I can appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, and I would just ask that we pay close attention to what's going on with the war on drugs, especially in South America, because
Yes, ma'am.
I, along with many others, believe there's a direct link between terrorism and
Oh, there's no
narcotics.
question about it. They are now merged.
Thank you, Mr.
gentle lady.
Secretary.
Mr. Wexler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I watched, Mr. Secretary, your presentation, as we all did, to the UN, and I watched with extraordinary pride because of who the messenger is, but probably more so because of what your message was. And I think you hit on the head both the case against Iraq and the principles of why America is doing what it's doing, and I applaud you for that. I also cannot commend you more and respectfully suggest that you continue articulating the bravery of the men and women at the State Department and the extraordinarily crucial role that they play. But what I'd like to do is what Mr. Berman did and share with you what my constituents are saying to me. And if we were in my part of South Florida today and we walked into a supermarket, we couldn't find a bottle of bottled water to buy. They're all bought up. If we went to Home Depot or if we went to any hardware store, we'd see hundreds, if not thousands, of World War II and Korean veterans standing online buying duct tape that they're going to take home to put on their windows and their doors to figure out how they're going to protect their two-bedroom condo and figure out which room in the condo is going to be their safe room in the impending biological or chemical attack that they're talking about in newspapers is occurring. Mr. Secretary, what they're saying to me yesterday and today is, Wexler, why are we in code orange? If we're in code orange because of Saddam Hussein and Iraq, then what are we waiting for? Let's go. But if we're in code orange because of something totally unrelated to Saddam Hussein and Iraq, then what are we doing? We're going to fight a war, win the war, and when the war is over, we're still going to be in code orange, or maybe then we'll be in code red because we will have totally emblazoned all the people who have put us in code orange to begin with. So I think the American people, regardless of how they feel about whether we should or should not engage in inspections, are totally confused. And with all due respect, the one part of the administration's response I don't fully appreciate, which was, I think, in part to Mr. Payne and Mr. Brown. You are absolutely right. It's unfair, it's ridiculous to ask you to predict how many people we're going to lose or how long it will take. But what I don't think is unfair to ask of you and the President, the American people, is what's our plan when we win the war if we have to fight it? Are we going in, is General Franks going to be the modern-day General MacArthur? Is it going to be the kind of thing where American troops are planning, we're committed to occupying in Iraq? Or are we talking to our allies about how they're going to help us in the occupation? Isn't going to be led by a Muslim country, because that might, soften the way. Is that Muslim country going to be Turkey again? It seems to me there are plans that need to have been made if we are going to prosecute this successfully to the end and accomplish what you call the liberation of Iraq. But I don't think the American people have heard that. And if they did, I think they'd feel a lot more comfortable about the risks they're taking today at Home Depot about what it is we're doing. And I would ask respectfully if you could explain to my constituents why we're in code orange. Does it relate to Iraq? And when we get done with the war, if we need it, are we still going to be in code orange? And if we are, does that mean we haven't eliminated the threat one bit as it relates to the homeland security?
We're facing different types of threats, sir, and code orange, whatever code we happen to be at, really doesn't reflect a particular threat from Iraq, but a threat from international terrorism and especially from al-Qaeda. And the reason for elevating the level of concern now is because there was specific intelligence that suggested that there were people who were targeting us in various ways, in the ways that you described. And as a prudent measure, the President decided, based on the advice from all of his advisors, intelligence and national security advisors, that would be a prudent thing to do. I don't think it's the kind of thing that should cause the nation to panic. And as Tom Ridge pointed out the other day in his press conference with the Attorney General, be prudent, maybe stock up on some things around that you might want to have in the house, but go about your daily life. Otherwise, we'll be scared forever. Now, that's easy for me to say. It's a little harder for you to explain in a Walmart in South Florida. But I hope that people will realize that we have to be alert to these threats that will come along from time to time. And it is irresponsible of the government not to share this kind of information with the public so that we can be more cautious. With respect to where we're going in Iraq, plans are being made, and we are starting to share the details of those plans with the public through congressional hearings. Yesterday, Undersecretary Grossman and Undersecretary Feith, State and Defense, briefed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There'll be more such briefings. Fact of the matter is, if we have to go with a military force, yes, it will be an American commander who will initially be in charge of that. And when the conflict has been prosecuted successfully, as I'm sure it will be, as quickly as we can, we want to transition out of military government, but we have an initial responsibility that are best handled by a military leader, and then transition to civil authority and ultimately Iraqi civil authority as fast as possible. I'm not sure the answer is for another Muslim country to be in the lead. It's not clear to me that that would mix as well as American. See, the thing about America is our power is understood, it's trusted. People can look at our history and see what that history tells them about what we do when we're faced with a situation like this. And so we're thinking about humanitarian concerns, we're thinking about building on the existing infrastructure that is in Iraq. We're thinking about how to put in place civil society, how to bring in our friends and allies to work with us. There are lots of people who have signed up to be part of it. Even those organizations, those countries rather, that are, shall we say, most vocal right now with respect to let's not get into a conflict, are going to be there to help us if a conflict does come along and in the aftermath of such a conflict. We know that. They've said so. And so I think you can say to your constituents that we have a problem in Iraq. We also have a problem with al-Qaeda. What we don't want to do, we're fighting hard to do now, is to keep those two from joining, that nexus between terrorism and sources of weapons of mass destruction, as represented by what's happening in Iraq.
Mr. Secretary, the time you've allotted to us has expired. May I impose for one more question?
Sir.
Thank you. Governor Janklow.
Mr. Secretary, as I told you once before several years ago, every time I have a chance to meet you in public or private, you remind me of the growing greatness of America, where cream still can rise to the top. Mr. Secretary, I'm new on this committee. I'm new to the Congress. I'm a son of an Army officer who was involved in the war trials in Nuremberg, Germany. We lived in Nuremberg when I was young. I have vivid memories of, even though I was young, of what went on during that period of time. I heard you today reference Charles de Gaulle in a comment that he made, I believe you said in 1956. I'm old enough to remember that when Charles de Gaulle assumed the presidency of France and gave up Algeria, which he indicated he wouldn't, the Foreign Legion and other French generals revolted. And there was a great fear in the world that the French army from North Africa was going to invade France. Once again, post-World War II, it was a president of the United States that said an attack on France proper by the army of France from outside of France would be an attack on the United States. And the generals stood down. I can also remember that it was, I believe, Charles de Gaulle who, when a few Frenchmen were fighting the Germans, he went to Britain. And when Americans and Brits and others were landing on the shores of Normandy and dying, he was on the radio broadcasts from Britain to France. And I'm also an American who remembers that the French have put, and they're great allies of ours, and when this is all over, they're still going to be our friends. They just happen to be our friends who sometimes put their mercenary interests and their monetary interests, I should say not mercenary, but monetary interests ahead of other people's interests. But I've got 3 questions that I'm concerned about. One, has America's government ever disclosed to our people the economic interests that our friends, the French, our friends, the Germans, and our friends, the Russians, have with Saddam Hussein's regime in terms of the financial benefits that they reap from their relationships with Saddam Hussein? 1. 2, Saddam Hussein is a man who's always been at war. We talk about war crimes trials, and we go around and pick up some of these lesser war criminals, and we put them on trial in Europe before the world's community and by the world's community. But if I recall, and I may be incorrect, I recall this is the guy, the only person, who's used poison gas since the First World War, and he used it in a conflict with his next-door neighbors in Iran. I believe he's the only person in history who's publicly gassed his own people when they disagreed with him. In the South, the Shiites, and I believe this is the same individual who his regime slaughtered the Kurds in the northern part of the country after the Kuwaiti incident. I believe this is the same individual who tried to assassinate the former President Bush when he visited one of the countries in the Middle East. And I believe this is the same individual that sent rockets and bombs to attack the nation of Israel that had no public hostility with him back when the people of Kuwait were being free. Yet he saw fit to attack the nation of Israel with rockets. And so what I was wondering for my second question was, are there any plans by our friends in Europe and the Soviet and Russia to put this war criminal on trial, he and the senior members of his regime, like they do others in the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere for war criminal activity that they've done against crimes against humanity that they've done against their neighbors and their own people? And third, and I realize these are disconnected questions, but my third question is, have our friends and allies, the British, the French, and the Russians, who have marvelous intelligence services, have any of them ever indicated that they, through their intelligence services, that they do not believe that Iraq possesses this minute weapons of mass destruction in the biological field, in the chemical field, and that they're working on acquiring the weapons in the nuclear field? Have any of those people ever indicated, I don't ask you to divulge confidences, secrets, but have any of them ever indicated that, that their intelligence services tell them Iraq this minute does not possess these types of weapons?
On the third question, I don't think any of their intelligence services would dare give such an assessment, because I'm quite confident that the KGB has not entirely disappeared from the mentality of the Soviet bureaucracy, and they still have competent intelligence services, and they know that they cannot give such an assurance that they are gone. The British intelligence service essentially agrees with our assessment. The others are much quieter with respect to what they say or do not say. In some cases, they just say, we don't know. I believe that they really do know, but they, for their own purposes, say they do not know. With respect to war crimes, we believe a solid case could be made that Saddam Hussein is subject to prosecution for war crimes, and we are constantly reviewing evidence and information should that ever come to be something that was about to be pursued. I don't think our colleagues, the ones you mentioned, have been forthcoming with respect to that regard. On the first one, with respect to economic interest, it's well known that all of the nations that you touched on, Governor, have a debt outstanding from Iraq. Iraq owes them money, and they have had financial interest in that country over the years. And I suspect at some point in the future they will seek to deal with their debt, and they understand I hope they keep in their calculus that sooner or later Iraq will be returned to a world of normal commercial activity, and I assume at that point they would want to have good relations with Iraq and the new leadership.
So, and sir, one final thing. You indicated in your response that you suspected that one or more of these nations had indicated they just don't know through their intelligence service, and you said you thought maybe they did know, but they said that. These people that you suspect know, but have told us no, they are also our allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, correct?
Let's just say they're friends of ours.
The gentleman's time has long expired. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for a most illuminating and instructive morning, and I yield to Mr. Lantos.
Mr. Chairman, before asking permission that members be permitted to submit questions, Ms. Secretary, on behalf of all the Democratic members, we express our deep appreciation to you and our admiration for your work.
Thank you, Mr. Lantos.
Without objection, the gentleman's request is granted, and the meeting stands adjourned. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Super. Hey, buddy, how you doing?
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld